The air in Section 4 of the West Desert Test Center always smelled like stale ozone, and the peppermint gum Major Harrison chewed to mask his smoker's breath. But at 0314 on a Tuesday, Specialist Elena Vance tasted something else on the back of her tongue. A faint, metallic copper note that shouldn't have been there. It was a phantom flavor, a ghost in the back of her throat that reminded her of the time her father took her into the belly of the Weirton steel mill when she was 7 years old, back when the Ohio River ran orange and the air itself felt heavy enough to swallow. She didn't say a word. She didn't move from her post by the reinforced polycarbonate observation window. She simply tightened her grip on her M4 carbine, her fingers tracing the familiar grit of the receiver, and waited for the pressure in her inner ear to tell her what the million-dollar sensors in the room were currently failing to report. Elena Vance was a ghost in her own life, a woman who had learned early that the best way to survive was to become part of the architecture. She grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, a town where the hills were made of slag and the clouds were soot, and where you learned to read the mood of a blast furnace the way a sailor reads the sea. Her father had been a foreman, a man who could tell by the specific pitch of a steam pipe if the pressure was going to blow 3 rooms away. He taught her that machines didn't lie, but they did have secrets, and if you listened long enough, they'd tell you exactly how they were planning to kill you. When the mills closed and the town began to fold into itself like a dying star, Elena didn't look for a way out through a scholarship or a marriage. She walked into the Army recruiting office on 4th Street because she wanted a world where the rules were written down and the gear was maintained by someone who gave a damn. She was 24, but her eyes held the stillness of someone who had already seen the end of things. She was CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. But at Dugway Proving Ground, she was mostly treated like a glorified security guard with a specialized mask. To the high-ranking civilian lab technicians and the officers with PhD tickets from MIT, she was just Specialist Vance, the girl from the Ohio Valley who checked badges and stood in the corners of rooms while they discussed the future of biological warfare. They saw her uniform, they saw the Vance on her chest, and they saw a junior enlisted soldier who was supposed to be seen and not heard. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked the subtle vibration of the HVAC vents. They didn't notice that she knew the exact rhythm of every air scrubber in the facility. Dugway was a place of vast, punishing silence. Located 80 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, it was a patch of desert larger than the state of Rhode Island, a landscape of salt flats and sagebrush where the U.S. military tested things the public wasn't supposed to think about. The West Desert Test Center was a fortress of concrete and pressurized steel, buried beneath layers of earth to ensure that if something went wrong, the only thing that suffered was the desert floor. Inside, the world was sterile, white, and governed by the steady hum of electricity. It smelled like bleach and jet fuel, a combination that Elena had come to associate with the feeling of safety. As long as those smells were there, the world was in its proper place. Her partner on the night shift was Corporal Miller, a guy from Georgia who talked too much about his truck and the girl he'd left behind in Savannah. He was a good soldier, but he was a bored watcher. He trusted the lights. If the panel said green, Miller was happy. He was currently leaning against the far wall, 20 feet from Elena, checking his watch for the 10th time in an hour. "Almost breakfast time, Vance," Miller whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile corridor. "Thinking about those powdered eggs and the way the mess hall smells like burnt bacon. You think they'll have the good salsa today?" Elena didn't look at him. She was focused on the copper taste. It was getting stronger, a sharp, electric tang that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Something's off, Miller. Yeah, my stomach. I'm telling you, those MREs from the field exercise are still sitting there like a brick." "Not your stomach," Elena said, her voice low and controlled. "The air. Look at the seal on the primary intake for Chamber B." Miller squinted at the heavy steel door 50 feet down the hall. It was a level 4 containment area currently housing a series of aerosolized agents for a durability test. "Looks fine to me. Light's green. Pressure is holding at 0. 5 inches of water gauge, just like the manual says." Elena closed her eyes for a second. She didn't need the gauge. She could feel the change in her sinus cavities. The atmospheric pressure in the corridor was shifting, not much, just a fraction of a millimeter of mercury, the kind of change you'd feel if a storm was rolling in over the Appalachian Mountains. But they were underground. There were no storms here. There was only the system. The light is green because the sensor is calibrated to a 3-second delay, Elena said. She shifted her weight, her boots making no sound on the polished floor. The seal isn't failing. The gasket is breathing. It's a rhythmic leak. Look at the dust on the floor near the base of the frame. It's moving in a circle, Miller. That's a vortex. Miller really looked this time and shrugged. I don't see anything, Vance. You're seeing ghosts again. My dad used to say that about the woods back home. Said some people see the deer and some people see the way the leaves move. You're a leaf mover, girl. Take a breath. Elena didn't take a breath. She took a step toward the intercom. She knew what she was capable of, even if she didn't have a name for it. Back in Steubenville, she'd stood in a garage with her uncle while he worked on a 1969 Chevy Nova. He'd be cursing at the carburetor, and she'd point to a tiny, microscopic crack in a vacuum line that he couldn't see with a magnifying glass. She just knew it was there because the engine sounded thin. It wasn't magic. It was a total, unwavering attention to the way the physical world fitted together. When a piece didn't fit, it screamed at her. She pressed the button for the internal comms. Control, this is Specialist Vance. I'm requesting an immediate diagnostic on the Chamber B outer seal. I'm seeing evidence of a pressure fluctuation. There was a long pause filled with the hiss of static. Then a voice came back, bored, condescending, and distinctly tired. It was Chief Warrant Officer Holloway, the night shift supervisor in the monitoring booth. Vance, my board shows Chamber B is nominal. Sensors 1 through 12 are all reporting green. Are you seeing an alarm? No, sir, no alarm. I'm seeing a physical pattern in the particulates at the base of the door. The pressure is pulsing. Particulates? Holloway let out a short, dry laugh. Vance, you're looking at dust in a hallway at 3 in the morning. Unless that door is rattling off its hinges, we aren't interrupting the cycle. These tests cost $40,000 an hour to run. We don't stop for dust. Stand your post. Elena felt the controlled rage simmer in her chest, a cold, hard knot that she kept tucked behind her ribs. It wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed by a voice over a speaker, and it wouldn't be the last. She was a specialist. She was a woman. She was the help. But she also knew that the copper taste was now a full-blown metallic burn on her tongue. She turned to Miller. Stay here. If that light turns yellow, you hit the manual override. Don't wait for Holloway. Where are you going? Miller asked, his eyes widening. Vance, you can't leave your post. I'm going to the tech lounge, she said, already moving. The morning shift for the research team is already in there prepping. They need to know. They're gonna eat you alive, Miller warned. Major Harrison is in there. He doesn't like being told his lab is leaking by a PFC+1. Elena didn't respond. She walked down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor, her gait steady and purposeful. She didn't run. Running created panic, and panic was a waste of energy. She moved with the dark competence of a person who had already accepted the consequences of her actions. If she was wrong, she'd be painting rocks in the desert sun for the next 6 months. If she was right, and she didn't act, people in this building wouldn't live to see the sunrise. The tech lounge was a glass-walled room filled with the smell of expensive coffee and the low murmur of people who believed they were the smartest people in the world. There were 4 of them, 3 civilian contractors in white lab coats and Major Harrison, the project lead, a man whose uniform was so crisp it looked like it had been carved out of green plastic. He was holding a ceramic mug and looking at a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Elena didn't knock. She walked through the pressurized door, sensing the slight whoosh of air as it cycled. Major Harrison, she said. The room went silent. The 3 civilians looked up, their expressions shifting from curiosity to a mild, annoyed confusion. Harrison didn't look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading, took a sip of his coffee, and then slowly raised his eyes. Specialist Vance, Harrison said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. I believe you're assigned to the security detail for the B-Wing corridor. Is there a reason you're in the lounge instead of standing next to Corporal Miller? Sir, Chamber B has a seal failure. Elena said. She didn't beg. She didn't use I think or I feel. She stated it as a physical fact like the temperature or the time. The gasket on the primary intake is breathing. Aerosolized particulates are bypassing the primary containment. We need to evacuate the wing and suit up the response team. One of the lab techs, a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a thin, judgmental mouth, let out a snort. A seal failure? Specialist, we have a triple redundant sensor array in that chamber. If there was a leak, the sirens would be loud enough to wake the dead in Salt Lake. My monitors show a perfect seal. Your monitors are averaging the data over a 60-second window to prevent false positives. Elena said, her eyes locked on Harrison. She ignored the tech. The leak is rhythmic. It's syncing with the HVAC cycle. Every time the air scrubbers kick in, the pressure differential drops just enough for the gasket to unseat. It's too fast for the sensors to register as a breach, but it's happening. I can taste it. Harrison lowered his mug. The annoyance in his eyes was being replaced by something sharper, a professional disdain. You can taste it, specialist. Is that what they're teaching at the CBRN school these days? Somatosensory detection of VX nerve agents. It's not VX, sir. It's the stabilizer, the methanol carrier. I can taste the copper, and I can feel the pressure drop in my ears. Major, the tech with the glasses said, turning back to his tablet. This is absurd. We're in the middle of the Viking series. If we stop the aerosolization now, the entire sample is compromised. We're talking weeks of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars. The girl is having a panic attack. I'm not having a panic attack, Dr. Aris, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming even more dangerously calm. I'm telling you that the air in the B-wing corridor is no longer grade A. If you don't suit up now, you're going to be breathing whatever is in that chamber within the next 10 minutes. Harrison stood up. He was a head taller than Elena, a man who had built a career on being right and making sure everyone knew it. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of his peppermint gum clashing with the metallic ghost in Elena's mouth. Specialist Vance, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. You are a security asset. Your job is to ensure that unauthorized personnel do not enter that wing and to report any alarms. You are not a scientist. You are not a censor. And you are certainly not in a position to tell me how to run this facility. Now you will return to your post, you will apologize to Corporal Miller for leaving him alone, and you will wait for the end of your shift. If I hear one more word about tasting the air, I will have you in front of the Colonel by 0800 for a psych eval and a formal reprimand. Do I make myself clear? Elena looked at him. She saw the tiny burst of capillaries in his cheeks. She saw the way his thumb was twitching against the handle of his mug. He was a man who relied on his rank to shield him from the world's unpredictability. He was terrified of being wrong, but even more terrified of being told he was wrong by someone like her. Crystal, sir, Elena said. She turned and walked out. She didn't look back at the lab techs who were already laughing, or at Harrison as he sat back down to his coffee. She walked back into the corridor, her heart beating a steady, rhythmic thrum in her chest. She wasn't afraid of the reprimand. She wasn't even afraid of the Colonel. She was afraid of the silence that was coming. When she got back to the post, Miller looked like he was about to jump out of his skin. What happened? You look like you just saw a ghost. They aren't coming, Elena said. She unslung her gas mask, the M50 protective mask, from its carrier on her thigh. She didn't put it on yet. That would be a violation of protocol that would get her arrested. But she checked the filters. She felt the rubber seal. She made sure the drinking tube was tucked. Vance, man, you gotta chill, Miller said, his voice shaking. You're gonna get us both in trouble. Look at the board, it's green, everything is green. Watch the vent, Miller, Elena said. She pointed to the high-volume air return vent above the chamber B door. Usually it was a dark, yawning rectangle that hummed with the sound of moving air. But now, in the harsh glare of the LED lights, a faint, shimmering haze was beginning to form. It looked like heat rising off a highway in July, a subtle distortion of the air that most people would dismiss as a trick of the light or a smudge on their glasses. I don't see anything, Miller whispered, though he was leaning forward now, his own hand drifting toward his mask. Vance, I don't see. Suddenly, the hum of the HVAC changed. It didn't get louder, but it shifted in pitch, moving from a low roar to a thin, metallic whine. In the tech lounge, 50 yards away, Major Harrison was laughing at something Dr. Aris had said. He reached for a donut in the box on the table, his fingers inches from the sugar-dusted pastry. Elena saw it first. A single drop of condensation formed on the exterior of the observation window. It didn't come from the inside. It formed on the hallway side. The air in the clean corridor was becoming saturated. Then the alarm finally tripped. It wasn't the screaming siren Elena had expected. It was a soft, rhythmic chirp from the ceiling sensors, the sound the system made when it was trying to decide if it was seeing a real threat or a glitch. There it is, Miller said, his face going pale. The yellow light. Vance, the light is yellow. It's not yellow, Miller, Elena said, her voice perfectly flat as she pulled her mask over her face, the rubber sealing against her skin with a familiar, claustrophobic suction. It's about to go red. Get your mask on, now. Through the clear visor of her mask, Elena watched the lounge. Through the glass, she saw Harrison stand up. He looked at the ceiling, a look of confused irritation on his face. He still had the donut in his hand. He looked at the intercom, probably about to call Holloway to complain about the glitchy sensor. And then the air in the lounge changed. The shimmer that Elena had seen in the hallway suddenly blossomed inside the safe room. It didn't come through the door. It came through the vents. The very system designed to keep them safe was now pumping the concentrated aerosol directly into the lounge. Dr. Aris was the first to react. He didn't scream. He simply stopped breathing. He sat back in his chair, his hands clawing at his throat, his eyes bulging behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The other two techs followed a second later, their bodies jerking in a synchronized dance of autonomic failure. Major Harrison dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, the brown liquid spreading out across the white tile, mingling with the white powdered sugar from his dropped donut. He stumbled toward the door, his hand reaching for the emergency suit-up locker that sat just 3 feet away. He didn't make it. He hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud, his body twitching as the nerve agent, a high-persistence organophosphate that Elena knew was designed to shut down the human nervous system in under 90 seconds, began its work. Miller was fumbling with his mask, his fingers shaking so hard he couldn't get the straps over his helmet. He was sobbing, a high, thin sound of pure terror. "Vance! Vance, help me!" Elena didn't hesitate. She stepped over to him, her movements precise and robotic. She grabbed his straps, yanked them tight, and cleared his seal with a sharp tug. She checked his intake valve. She ensured he was breathing filtered air. Then she turned back to the glass. Major Harrison was on his back. He was looking directly at her through the glass. His eyes were wide, filled with a primal, agonizing realization. He was dying in the room she had told him to evacuate. He was drowning in the air she had told him was poison. He tried to lift a hand, a weak, fluttering gesture toward the suit-up locker, toward the life-saving gear he had refused to touch on her word alone. Elena stood there. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel the "I told you so" she had imagined. She felt only the cold, hard weight of the mission. She felt the cost of being right in a world that only valued the lights on the board. She reached for her radio. "Control, this is Specialist Vance," she said, her voice muffled but clear through the mask's diaphragm. "We have a catastrophic containment breach in B-Wing and the tech lounge. Major Harrison and 3 civilians are down. I am initiating a Level 5 lockdown. Do not send a rescue team without full MOP Level 4 gear. The ventilation system is compromised." "Vance," Holloway's voice came back, no longer bored. Now it was cracking with a sudden, sharp edge of panic. "Vance, what are you talking about? The board just went full red. Everything is red." "I know," Elena said. She looked at Miller. He was leaning against the wall, his chest heaving as he stared through the glass at the twitching bodies in the lounge. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, he didn't see a leaf mover. He didn't see a girl from Ohio. He saw the only person in the building who knew exactly what was happening. "What do we do?" Miller rasped through his mask. "Vance, what do we do?" Elena looked down the long, red-lit corridor. The sirens were finally screaming now, a deafening, rhythmic howl that echoed off the concrete walls. The lights were flashing, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. "We do our jobs, Miller," she said. She checked her weapon. She checked her seal. She thought about the steel mill in Steubenville and the way her father had told her that when the pressure starts to climb, you don't run. You find the valve, you find the leak, and you stay until the job is done. "Wait here," she said. "Where are you going?" Elena didn't answer. She was already moving toward the airlock. She knew something the sensors hadn't picked up yet. The leak wasn't just in B-Wing. The rhythmic pulse she'd felt, the breathing gasket, it wasn't a failure of the seal. It was a failure of the main manifold. The pressure wasn't just dropping in the chamber, it was building in the primary storage tanks. The breathing she'd seen was just the exhaust. The real explosion was still coming. She reached the airlock door, the heavy steel portal that led into the heart of the test center. She placed her hand on the cold metal. She could feel it now, a deep, low-frequency vibration that hummed in the marrow of her bones. It was the sound of a system about to tear itself apart. She looked back once. Miller was watching her, his mask reflecting the red emergency lights. Beyond him, in the lounge, the movement had stopped. Major Harrison was still. The civilians were still. The only thing moving was the white shimmering haze drifting like a ghost through the room. Elena turned back to the door and punched her override code into the keypad. The light turned from red to green. The door hissed open, and Specialist Elena Vance walked into the dark, screaming heart of the breach, alone. The corridor beyond the airlock was a tunnel of white noise. The primary alarms were localized, but the secondary systems, the ones meant to keep the pressurized chambers from imploding, were groaning. Elena could feel the vibration in the soles of her boots. It wasn't just air moving anymore, it was the building itself, reacting to a pressure differential that was rapidly approaching a critical failure point. She moved with a deliberate, haunting slowness. In a CBRN environment, speed was a trap. If you moved too fast, you tore your suit. If you moved too fast, you tripped and cracked your faceplate. If you moved too fast, you missed the subtle signs of the world trying to kill you. She was a scavenger of details, her eyes scanning the ceiling pipes, her hands occasionally reaching out to touch a junction box, feeling for the heat that would indicate an electrical short. She reached the intersection of B-wing and the central manifold. This was the spine of the facility, where the concentrated agents were piped from the subterranean storage tanks up into the test chambers. It was a forest of stainless steel and color-coded valves. Usually the air here was the coldest in the facility, kept at a steady 40 degrees to stabilize the chemicals. Now it was hot. Elena stopped. She adjusted the airflow on her mask, the cool, filtered oxygen hissing into her lungs. The heat was wrong. It was a localized pocket radiating from the floor. She knelt, her gloved hand pressing against the reinforced concrete. It was vibrating, not the rhythmic hum of the HVAC, but a jagged, uneven stutter. "Control," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the sea of sirens. "This is Vance. I'm at the B-wing intersection. The floor temperature is elevated. I think we have a pump cavitation in the primary storage vault. The agent isn't just leaking, it's boiling." Boiling? Holloway's voice was strained, the sound of a man who was looking at a screen that no longer made sense to him. "Vance, those tanks are chilled to near freezing. There's no way, hold on. Sensor 44 just went off scale. It's reporting a temperature of 200 degrees. That's impossible. The cooling system is showing green." "The cooling system is showing green because it's cooling the sensor, not the tank," Elena said. She stood up, her eyes tracking the pipes that led down into the floor. "The leak I saw at the door was the pressure relief valve failing. The system is trying to bleed off the gas, but the pump is locked in an overcycle. If that tank hits the flashpoint, the entire B-wing becomes a fuel-air bomb." Silence on the other end. Holloway wasn't a chemist, he was a technician. He knew how to read a board, but he didn't know how to read the mood of a failing machine. "What do we do?" Holloway finally asked. There was a subtle shift in his tone. He was no longer the superior officer. He was a man drowning, and Elena was the only thing floating. "Kill the power to the B-sector pumps," Elena said. "Manually, don't use the software override. The software is what's keeping the pump running. You need to pull the physical breakers in the substation." "Vance, the substation is on the other side of the facility. I'd have to send a team through the A-wing, and the A-wing is currently under a precautionary lockdown. It would take 20 minutes to cycle them through the decon line." "We don't have 20 minutes, Elena said. She looked at the heavy, lead-lined hatch in the floor. It was the manual access to the pump vault. It was a hole in the ground that led directly into the source of the heat. "I'm going down," she said. "Vance, negative. That's a confined space. You don't have a backup. You don't have a comms tether. If you go down there and the seal fails, you're dead." "I'm already dead if that tank blows, sir," Elena said. She didn't say it for effect. It was just a calculation. The blast radius of a pressurized agent tank would level the West Desert Test Center and send a plume of neurotoxins into the Utah sky that would reach the outskirts of Tuel by noon. She didn't wait for his response. She hooked her M4 to her chest rig, freeing her hands. She grabbed the handle of the hatch. It was hot. Even through her heavy CBRN gloves, she could feel the searing heat of the metal. She braced her boots against the floor and pulled. The hatch groaned, the vacuum seal fighting her for a second before it gave way with a wet, sucking sound. A cloud of thick, yellowish vapor hissed out of the opening, obscuring her vision for a heartbeat. Elena didn't flinch. She waited for the vapor to clear, then swung her legs over the edge and found the rungs of the ladder. The vault was a nightmare of sound and heat. The pump, a massive, cast-iron beast, was screaming, a high-pitched metal-on-metal shriek that made her teeth ache. The floor was covered in an inch of the yellowish liquid, the agent itself, boiling as it touched the overheated motor casing. Elena hit the bottom of the ladder and felt the liquid splash against her boots. She was in a level 4 suit, designed to resist chemical penetration for up to 4 hours, but she could feel the heat through the soles. She had maybe 10 minutes before the integrity of the rubber began to fail. She moved toward the pump. The vibration here was so intense it felt like her organs were being shaken loose. She could see the problem immediately. A bypass valve had sheared off, and the jagged metal had jammed the cooling fan. Without the fan, the motor was melting itself, and the heat was transferring directly into the pressurized tank. She reached for the manual shut-off valve, a large iron wheel coated in a layer of greasy condensation. She grabbed it and turned. It didn't move. The heat had expanded the metal, locking the threads. Elena braced herself, her muscles straining against the suit. She was not a large woman, but she was a woman built of Steubenville steel. She knew how to use her weight, how to find the leverage that the men she'd grown up with had used to move the heavy slag buckets. She growled, a low, guttural sound that was lost in the roar of the pump. She threw her entire body into the turn, nothing. She looked around the vault. It was a cramped, claustrophobic box. To her left, a row of emergency tools was mounted to the wall. She saw a heavy pipe wrench, its red paint peeling from the heat. She grabbed it, stepped back into the boiling liquid, and hooked the wrench onto the valve wheel. "Come on," she whispered, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Come on, you bastard." She slammed her weight against the wrench, once, twice. On the third hit, there was a sharp, metallic crack asterisk that sounded like a gunshot. The valve moved a quarter-inch. She didn't stop. She pushed again, the wrench groaning under the pressure. The valve began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing ease as the flow of agent was constricted. The screaming of the pump changed. It dropped in pitch, moving from a shriek to a low, dying moan. The vibration in the floor began to smooth out. Elena kept turning until the wheel hit the stop. The vault went silent. The only sound now was the hiss of the boiling liquid on the floor and the steady, rhythmic rasp of Elena's breathing inside her mask. She stood there for a moment, her hands still gripping the wrench, her head bowed. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that seemed to be trying to crush her into the floor. "Vance!" Holloway's voice was a whisper in her ear. "Vance, the pressure is dropping. The sensors, they're coming back into range. What did you do?" "Shut it down," Elena said. She leaned her head against the cool stainless steel of the tank. "The pump is dead. The leak is stopped." "We're sending the response team," Holloway said, his voice thick with an emotion Elena couldn't quite identify. It sounded like relief, but there was something else in it, shame maybe. "They're 5 minutes out. Just stay there, Vance. Don't move." Elena didn't move. She couldn't have moved if she wanted to. The adrenaline was beginning to drain out of her, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that felt like lead in her veins. She looked down at her boots. The yellow liquid was still there, but it was no longer boiling. She thought about Major Harrison. She thought about the way he'd looked at her through the glass, the way his hand had reached for a locker he hadn't believed he'd ever need. He had been a man of rules and boards and lights. He had lived in a world where a specialist's word was worth less than a sensor's glitch. She realized then that she didn't care if they gave her a medal or a court-martial. She didn't care if Harrison lived or died, or if the Army ever acknowledged that she had saved the lives of everyone in the facility. She knew what she had done. She had heard the secret the machine was keeping, and she had answered it. She stayed in the vault, standing in the cooling poison, waiting for the people who would never understand how she had known. The response team arrived 5 minutes later. They came down the ladder in a flurry of movement, their heavy level 4 suits making them look like white-clad astronauts in a hellscape. They grabbed her, their gloved hands checking her seals, their voices a muffled cacophony of questions she didn't answer. They led her up the ladder, through the airlock, and into the decon line. The decontamination process was a long, cold ritual of chemical showers and pressurized air. They stripped her suit off layer by layer, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, testing her hair and her fingernails for any trace of the agent. When it was over, they gave her a set of oversized gray sweats and a blanket and sat her in a small, windowless briefing room. The door opened and a man walked in. He wasn't Harrison. He was an older man, a colonel with gray hair and eyes that looked like they had been carved out of the desert salt. He had a file in his hand, and he sat down across from her without saying a word. He looked at her for a long time, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Specialist Vance," he said finally. "My name is Colonel Miller, no relation to your partner." Elena nodded. She was shivering, the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The metallic taste was gone, replaced by the bitter, chemical tang of the decon scrub. "I've spent the last hour reviewing the sensor logs and the audio from the comms," the colonel said. He opened the file and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a graph of the pressure in Chamber B. "This is what the system saw, a steady, nominal line." He slid another paper across. This one was a high-resolution analysis of the audio from the corridor. "This is what the internal microphones picked up. If you look at the frequency around 30 Hz, there's a micro-pulse. It's barely a flicker. The system filtered it out as background noise from the HVAC. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Major Harrison is in the ICU. He's stable, but the doctors say he'll have permanent neurological damage. The other 3 techs, they didn't make it. Elena didn't say anything. She didn't feel a flicker of emotion. She just watched the colonel. Major Harrison's last official report, filed 4 hours ago, suggested you be reassigned for psychological instability and insubordination. The colonel said. He picked up the report and with a slow, deliberate movement tore it in half. I've talked to Corporal Miller, the colonel continued. He told me what you saw, what you tasted. He said you told him to suit up before the alarm ever tripped. The colonel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. Tell me the truth, Vance. How did you know? And don't give me that tasting the air crap. I want to know how a 24-year-old girl from Ohio saw a breach that $40 million worth of technology missed. Elena looked at him. She saw the question in his eyes, the same question her father had asked her when she was 7, standing in the middle of a steel mill that was about to blow. She thought about the dark competence of the world she lived in. The world where the people in charge relied on the lights and the people in the corners relied on the truth. The sensors are designed to see what we tell them to see, sir, Elena said, her voice steady and clear for the first time since the breach. They see the average. They see the pattern we expect. I don't look for the pattern, Colonel. I look for the thing that doesn't fit. The colonel stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. Get some sleep, specialist, he said. You're being reassigned to my personal staff. We're going to be doing a full audit of every containment system in this facility, and I want you to be the one who tells me what doesn't fit. He walked to the door, then stopped and looked back. And Vance, yes, sir. The next time you tell someone to suit up, they're going to listen. I'll make sure of that. He walked out, leaving Elena alone in the room. She sat there for a long time, the gray blanket pulled tight around her. She looked at her hands. They were still shaking, just a little. The cost of being right was a weight she would carry for the rest of her life, a shadow that would follow her into every room she ever entered. But as she sat there in the silence of the bunker, she realized something. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a system waiting to fail. It was the silence of a world that had finally, for the first time, been forced to listen. She closed her eyes and took a breath. The air tasted like nothing. It tasted like bleach and cold electricity and the sterile, empty desert. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. The silence in the briefing room was thick, the kind of heavy, artificial quiet that only exists in reinforced concrete bunkers 40 feet below the Utah Salt Flats. Elena Vance sat on the edge of the plastic chair, her spine a straight line of rigid discipline, watching the way the dust motes danced in the beam of the overhead projector. They moved in a chaotic, tumbling frenzy, yet she could see the pattern in them, the way the draft from the vent in the corner pushed them in a lazy, counterclockwise spiral. To anyone else, it was just air. To Elena, it was a map of the room's hidden failures. She stayed in that room for 3 hours after Colonel Miller left. Nobody came to check on her. Nobody brought her a glass of water or asked if she needed to call her family. That was the military way. You were either the mission or you were the gear, and right now, Elena was gear that had been moved into temporary storage. When the door finally opened, it wasn't a medic or a counselor. It was a young lieutenant with a face like a slapped ham and a clipboard that he held like a shield. He didn't look her in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the Vance name tape on her borrowed sweatshirt. Specialist Vance, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Your personal effects have been moved to Building 104. You've been cleared for restricted duty pending the results of the Board of Inquiry. You're to report to the basement archive at 0800 tomorrow. Colonel Miller's orders. Elena stood up. The movement was fluid, controlled, despite the fact that every muscle in her legs felt like it had been shredded and reassembled with wire. The archive, sir? It's where the audit is being centralized, the lieutenant said, finally meeting her eyes for a split second before looking away. There was fear there. Not the fear of a soldier looking at an enemy, but the fear of a bureaucrat looking at a variable he couldn't control. The colonel wants everything from the last 5 years pulled. Every PMCS report, every atmospheric sensor log, every gasket replacement order. You're the subject matter expert. The way he said *subject matter expert * made it sound like a slur. Understood, sir, Elena said. She walked out of the room and into the corridor. The smell of the facility hit her again, but it was different now. The ozone was gone. The metallic copper was gone. Now it just smelled of industrial floor wax and the faint, sour sweat of 1,000 people living under a mountain of dirt. She walked past the elevators that led up to the surface, toward the barracks, and realized she didn't want to go back to her bunk. She didn't want to see the empty space where Miller used to sit, or hear the whispers of the other soldiers who would now treat her like she was made of glass or unexploded ordnance. She found herself walking toward the motor pool instead. The West Desert Test Center at night was a landscape of harsh shadows and blue-tinted security lights. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees since the sun went down, the desert air turning brittle and sharp. She found Corporal Miller leaning against the fender of a Humvee, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He wasn't supposed to be smoking on the line, but the NCO in charge of the gate was looking the other way. Miller saw her and didn't move, but the tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. He took a long drag and exhaled a plume of gray smoke into the cold Utah night. "They didn't arrest you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Not yet," Elena replied. She stepped into the circle of light shed by the motor pool's sodium lamps. The orange glow made her look pale, almost spectral. "They're putting me in the basement, the audit." Miller spat on the gravel. "The basement, figures. They can't fire you because the colonel is breathing down their necks, and they can't promote you because you made Harrison look like a God-fearing idiot in front of the whole world. So they bury you under paper." "It's not just paper, Miller," Elena said. She looked toward the dark silhouette of the B-wing in the distance. Even from here, she could see the flickering strobes of the cleanup crews. "The colonel wants to know how it happened. He wants the truth. The truth is a dangerous thing to go looking for in a place that's built on secrets, Vance," Miller said. He flicked his cigarette butt into the dark, where it died in a tiny spray of sparks. "I got my orders 10 minutes ago. I'm your driver, your logistical support. They took me off the security detail, said I was compromised by proximity." Elena looked at him. Miller was a simple man from Georgia who liked trucks and high-volume country music, but he had stayed when the air turned to poison. He had trusted her life with his, and in the military, that was a debt that was never truly paid off. It was just carried. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," Miller grunted. He opened the driver's side door. "I'd rather be in the basement with someone who knows when the air is turning than up on the wire with a bunch of guys who think a green light means they are immortal. Get in. I'll take you to the 104. The drive was silent. The Humvee's heater was broken, blowing a thin stream of lukewarm air that smelled of old dog and diesel. Elena watched the desert go by, the salt flats white and shimmering under the moon, looking like a frozen sea. She could feel the vibration of the engine through the seat, a jagged, uneven rhythm that told her the fuel injectors were dirty. She didn't say anything. She just let the vibration hum in her bones, a reminder that the world was still mechanical, still predictable, if you knew how to listen. Building 104 was a relic from the 1950s, a squat, windowless block of yellowing concrete that sat on the edge of the old area. It had been built to house the first generation of biological testing records, back when they did things in the open air that would make a modern senator's hair turn white. The air inside smelled of dust and vinegar, the scent of decaying microfilm. The basement was a labyrinth of rolling steel shelves, thousands of brown cardboard boxes stacked 10 feet high. It was lit by a single row of buzzing fluorescent tubes that cast a flickering, sickly light over everything. Elena stood in the center of the room and closed her eyes. She didn't look at the boxes. She listened. The building was old, and it was breathing. She could hear the rustle of the wind against the exterior vents, the drip of a leaky pipe 3 levels up, the hum of the transformer in the wall. And beneath it all there was a sound she didn't recognize, a low-frequency throb like the beating of a giant subterranean heart. It was too slow to be a motor, too rhythmic to be the wind. "You okay?" Miller asked, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. He was holding a stack of file folders the lieutenant had given him. "This building," Elena whispered, "it's connected to the main manifold. Everything is connected to the manifold out here, Vance. It's the only way they get water and power to these old blocks." "No," Elena said, her eyes snapping open. She walked toward the back wall, past the shelves of records from the 1960s. She put her hand against the concrete. It was cold, but not the cold of stone. It was the cold of moving air. "The manifold is pressurized, but this is a return line. They're using the basement of 104 as a plenum for the old ventilation system." "English, Vance, I'm a Georgia boy, remember?" "It's an exhaust," Elena said. She looked at the boxes. They weren't just stacked here for storage. They were positioned in long, straight rows that created a series of channels. They aren't just storing records here, Miller. They're using the records to baffle the sound of the exhaust. She moved to the nearest box, labeled Asterisk Project Bluebell 1974 Maintenance Logs Asterisk. She pulled it down. The box was heavy, but when she opened it, the papers inside were pristine. There was no dust. In a room this old, in a desert this dry, there should have been dust on everything. She ran her finger along the edge of the box. The air is being filtered before it hits this room, but why filter exhaust? Miller walked over, his brow furrowed. Maybe to keep the records from rotting? No, you filter intake to protect what's inside. You filter exhaust to hide what's coming out. Elena felt the first spark of something that wasn't just competence, it was suspicion. It was the same feeling she got when a foreman at the steel mill told her a machine was just settling, when she knew the bearings were about to seize. It was the feeling of being lied to by something that didn't have a tongue. The next 3 days were a blur of paper and gray coffee. Elena and Miller worked 14-hour shifts, pulling every record related to Chamber B. They found the maintenance logs Harrison had signed off on. They found the invoices for the gaskets, cheap commercial-grade rubber that had been billed as military-spec Vitten. "Look at this," Elena said on the 4th night. She spread 3 different spreadsheets across the floor. "This is the procurement trail for the Viking series. They bought 300 of these gaskets, but Chamber B only has 12 intake ports." Miller leaned over, rubbing his eyes. "Maybe they bought spares. People lose stuff, Vance. I lost a whole torque wrench once." 300 spares for 12 ports, and look at the delivery dates. They've been replacing these gaskets every 2 weeks for the last 6 months. "That's impossible," Miller said. "A Vitten gasket lasts 5 years, even in a high-corrosive environment. If they are replacing them every 2 weeks, the agent they are testing isn't just a neurotoxin. It's an acid." "It's not an acid," Elena said. She picked up a separate file, one she'd found tucked in the back of a box labeled *HVAC Secondary Schematics*. "I checked the chemical signatures from the breach. It was a standard organophosphate carrier. It shouldn't have touched the rubber." She stood up and began to pace the narrow aisle between the shelves. Her movements were sharp, restless. The controlled rage was back, cold and hard. "The gaskets weren't failing because of the agent, Miller. They were being made asterisk to fail. Why the hell would anyone want a containment chamber to leak?" "Not a leak," Elena said. "A pulse, like I saw at the door. If you time the failure of the gasket with the cycle of the HVAC, you can move small, undetectable amounts of the agent into the secondary ventilation lines. Not enough to trip the alarms, but enough to." She stopped. She looked at the ceiling, at the dark, yawning rectangle of the vent that fed into the basement of Building 104. "Enough to saturate the surrounding buildings," she whispered. Miller stood up, his face going pale. "You're saying they're testing on us? On the base?" "I don't know," Elena said. "But someone has been manipulating the maintenance schedule to ensure that the containment was never 100%. Harrison wasn't just incompetent, he was a delivery man." The realization felt like a physical blow. The institutional failure wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system itself. The bureaucracy, the cheap parts, the human error, it was all a shroud, a way to conduct an experiment without anyone ever realizing they were the subjects. She thought about the Viking series. They had told her it was about durability. They just hadn't told her whose durability they were testing. "We have to tell the colonel," Miller said, his hand reaching for his radio. "No," Elena said, grabbing his wrist. Her grip was like a vice. "The colonel sent us here, but who sent the colonel? Who told him to put the unstable specialist in the basement where she'd find exactly what they wanted her to find?" Miller looked at her, his eyes wide. "You think the colonel is in on it?" "I think in this place everyone is in on it until they aren't," Elena said. She let go of his wrist. "If we go to him now with just paper, they'll just shred the paper and bury us deeper. We need physical proof. We need to see where that air is going. Vance, that's Sector 7, that's restricted, even for the colonel's staff. We go over there without a work order, they'll have us in the brig before we can say gasket." "Then we don't go as staff," Elena said. She looked at her watch. 0200. The shift change for the perimeter guards was in 20 minutes. She knew the rhythm of this base better than she knew her own heartbeat. She knew which cameras had a 3-second blind spot when they panned, and she knew which gates were manned by kids who were more interested in their phones than their posts. "I'm going, Miller," she said. "You don't have to. You've done enough." Miller looked at the stacks of boxes, then at the dark, humming vent in the ceiling. He looked at Elena, seeing the woman who had walked into a boiling vault of nerve agent without flinching. "My truck is outside," he said. It's got a dirty fuel injector, but it'll get us to the wire. The drive to the perimeter of Sector 7 was a masterclass in tension. They didn't use the main roads. Miller drove the Humvee through the salt scrub and the sagebrush, keeping the headlights off and relying on the faint green glow of the night vision goggles. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her M4 across her knees, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the base around them, a massive, sleeping beast. Every few miles they'd pass a sensor tower, its red light blinking like a predatory eye. Elena would count the seconds, timing their movement to the sweep of the radar. "There," she whispered, pointing to a low, sprawling complex of corrugated steel buildings. "The Atmospheric Research Lab, that's where the 104 vent terminates." The lab was surrounded by a double layer of chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire. There were no lights on inside, but the perimeter was patrolled by a pair of automated sentry drones, small, multi-legged machines that scurried along the fence line like mechanical spiders. "Those things have thermal," Miller whispered, pulling the Humvee to a stop behind a low dune. "We can't get within 50 yards without being lit up like a Christmas tree." "The drones are slaved to the central hub in Hangar 3, Elena said. She was already unzipping her pack. "They have a cooling cycle. Every 10 minutes they dock for 30 seconds to vent the heat from their processors. If we move when they dock, we have a window. 30 seconds to cross 50 yards of open sand and cut a fence? Vance, you're good, but you aren't that good." "I'm not cutting the fence," Elena said. She pulled out a small, handheld device, a signal jammer she'd borrowed from the comms locker in Building 104. "I'm going to tell the hub that the drones are already docked." She looked at Miller. "Stay with the vehicle. If the lights come on, you drive. Don't wait for me." "Vance." "That's an order, Corporal," she said, her voice hard as flint. She slipped out of the Humvee and disappeared into the dark. The sand was cold and grit-fine, muffled her footsteps as she sprinted toward the fence. She could hear the whine of the drones, a high-pitched, mosquito-like buzz. She watched the nearest one, a dark shape against the stars. It reached the docking station, a small, shielded box on a pole. *1, 2, 3. She clicked the jammer. The drone froze. Its lights flickered from red to amber, then went dark. Elena didn't run. Running was for people who didn't know the terrain. She moved in a low, efficient crouch, her body a shadow among shadows. She reached the fence, not at the gate, but at a point where the sand had drifted up against the concrete base. She didn't cut the wire, she dug. Her fingers clawed at the frozen earth, the salt crust tearing at her cuticles. She didn't feel the pain. She felt only the rhythm of the clock in her head. 20 seconds. She slid under the fence, her jacket snagging on a barb. She heard the fabric tear, a sound like a gunshot in the silence, but she didn't stop. She rolled onto the other side, flattened herself against the ground, and waited. The drone's lights snapped back to red. It hummed to life and continued its patrol, its thermal eye passing inches over where she lay. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She became part of the architecture, a ghost in the salt. When the drone was gone, she moved toward the lab. The building was older than it looked. The corrugated steel was rusted at the seams, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of desert grime. She found the intake vent, a massive, rotating fan that pulled the air from the manifold system. It wasn't moving. Elena frowned. If this was the termination point for the 104 exhaust, the fan should be running at full capacity to scrub the air. She knelt by the housing and pressed her ear to the metal. She didn't hear a fan. She heard voices. "Not a question of ethics, Doctor. It's a question of baseline data. If we don't have a control group that's been exposed to the sublethal concentrations, the Odyssey results won't mean a damn thing to the Joint Chiefs." Elena froze. The voice was cold, clinical, and hauntingly familiar. It was Dr. Aris. But Aris is dead, she thought. I saw him go down in the lounge. I saw him clawing at his throat. She moved to the nearest window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She rubbed a small circle in the grime and peered inside. The interior of the lab was a high-tech clean room, illuminated by the soft blue glow of a dozen monitors. There were 4 people inside, all in white lab coats, and standing in the center of the room looking perfectly healthy was Dr. Aris. He was holding a tablet, gesturing toward a map of the base. The map was covered in a series of concentric circles, color-coded by exposure levels. "The breach in B-Wing was a setback," Aris was saying. Harrison panicked. He wasn't supposed to let the concentration hit those levels. But the accident gave us something better than a simulation. It gave us real-time data on the acute phase. "And Specialist Vance?" another scientist asked. The colonel says she's digging into the logs. Aris let out a short, dry laugh. Let her dig. By the time she finds anything that makes sense, the Odyssey test will be complete. She's a security asset, not an analyst. She sees the dust, but she doesn't see the broom. Elena felt a coldness wash over her that had nothing to do with the desert night. It was the dark competence shifting into something else. A dark, crystalline clarity. They hadn't just been testing on the base. They had staged the breach to see how the personnel would react to a lethal dose. Major Harrison hadn't been a victim of his own incompetence. He'd been a variable. And the 3 civilians who had died, they were just baseline data. She reached for her camera, her fingers steady despite the rage screaming in her brain. She took photos of the monitors, the maps, the face of the dead man who was standing 5 feet away from her. She had the proof, she had the something that didn't fit. But as she turned to slip back toward the fence, she felt a change in the air. The low-frequency throb she'd heard in the basement of Building 104, the beating heart, suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. And then the sirens began, not the rhythmic chirp of a sensor glitch, and not the screaming howl of a containment breach. This was a long, steady, mournful tone, the sound of a full-base evacuation. "What the hell?" Miller's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Vance, you seeing this? The whole base is going dark, they're killing the power." Elena looked back at the lab. Inside, the scientists were scrambling, but they didn't look panicked. They looked like they were following a script. They were grabbing hard drives, sealing samples, moving with the practiced efficiency of a team that knew exactly what was about to happen. "Miller, get the Humvee to the gate," Elena hissed into the mic. "Now, they aren't evacuating, they're cleaning." "Cleaning? What does that mean?" "It means they are about to vent the entire manifold," Elena said, her voice shaking with the sheer scale of the horror. "They're going to purge the system before the Board of Inquiry arrives tomorrow. They're going to dump everything into the air." She looked at the circles on the map through the window. The largest circle, the one labeled total saturation, covered the entire housing area. The barracks, the mess hall, the infirmary where Major Harrison was currently lying in a coma. Thousands of soldiers sleeping in their beds, thinking they were safe in the middle of a desert they were sworn to protect. "I have to stop the purge," Elena said. "Vance, you can't. The main valve is in the central hub. There's a battalion of MPs between you and that lever." "I'm not going to the hub," Elena said. She looked at the lab, then at the massive, silent intake vent. "I'm going to reverse the flow." She didn't wait for Miller to argue. She ran toward the back of the lab where the secondary generator was housed. She knew the design of these old buildings. They were modular. If you could bypass the central control and jump the motor, you could make the fan spin in the opposite direction. It wouldn't stop the purge, but it would suck the agent back into the lab. It would turn the atmospheric research lab into a giant vacuum bag. She reached the generator housing and ripped the cover off. The wires were a tangled mess of red and black, but to Elena they were as clear as a road map. She pulled her combat knife and began to strip the insulation. "Vance, the drones," Miller yelled. "They're coming back online, they've got a lock on you." She didn't look up. She could hear them, the high-pitched whine of the motors, the skittering of metal legs on the concrete. She could see the red lasers dancing across the wall of the generator shed, searching for her heart. She grabbed the main power lead and the secondary override. Her hands were wet with sweat, the saltaire making her skin sting. "Just 10 seconds," she whispered. "Just give me 10 seconds." The first drone rounded the corner, its sensor eye glowing a murderous crimson. It paused, its processor calculating the threat level of the woman in the gray sweatshirt. Elena looked the drone in the eye. "Do it," she whispered. She slammed the wires together. A massive arc of blue electricity lit up the night, throwing Elena backward. The smell of ozone, real ozone, filled the air. The generator groaned, a deep mechanical sob, and then the massive intake fan on the roof began to spin. It didn't hum. It roared. Inside the lab, she heard a window shatter as the pressure differential suddenly reversed. The scientists screamed as the air they had been so carefully measuring, was sucked back into the room at 200 miles per hour. Elena hit the ground hard, her head spinning, her vision blurred by the afterimage of the spark. She could feel the vibration in the earth, a new rhythm, a violent, chaotic stutter. The drones were frozen, their signals jammed by the massive EMP from the generator. "Vance, Vance, talk to me." Miller was screaming in her ear. She tried to speak, but her lungs felt like they were filled with sand. She pushed herself up, her fingers digging into the salt crust. She looked at the lab. The corrugated steel was buckling under the pressure. The atmospheric research lab was imploding, folding in on itself like a crushed soda can. She had stopped the purge. She had contained the baseline data in the very room where it had been created, but the cost was already being calculated. She could hear the sirens of the MP vehicles now, the flashing blue and red lights approaching from the main base. They weren't coming to rescue her. They were coming to secure the site. Elena looked at the fence. She looked at the dark desert beyond. Miller, she rasped, her voice a ghost of itself. Get the truck, we're leaving. Vance, they'll hunt us. There's nowhere to go but the desert. I know, Elena said. She stood up, her silhouette sharp against the imploding lab. She didn't look like a specialist anymore. She didn't look like a soldier. She looked like the only thing that survives when the world decides to lie to itself. She looked like the truth. Pick me up at the 5-mile marker, she said. She turned and began to run, not away from the danger, but into the dark, empty heart of the desert. She moved with a purpose that no regulation could define and no order could command. Behind her, the West Desert Test Center was a hive of panicked lights and screaming sirens. But ahead of her, there was only the silence of the salt flats and the cold, indifferent stars. She reached the fence and slid under the gap she had dug. She didn't look back. She didn't look at the fire or the MPs or the ruins of the lab. She looked at her hands. They were covered in grease and dirt and blood. She closed her eyes and took a breath. The air tasted like salt. It tasted like cold earth. And for the first time in her life, it tasted like a war that she was actually going to win. She was halfway to the marker when she heard the sound of a heavy engine. It wasn't Miller's Humvee. It was something larger, a Bradley fighting vehicle, its tracks chewing up the desert floor as it cut across the flats to intercept her. They weren't going to let her walk away. They couldn't. Elena stopped. She didn't hide. She stood in the middle of the white salt, her arms at her sides, her head held high. The Bradley slowed as it approached, the massive turret swiveling to fix its cannon on her. The spotlight snapped on, blinding her, turning the world into a wall of white fire. Specialist Vance, a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Remain where you are, drop your weapon and put your hands on your head. Elena didn't move. She didn't drop her M4. She didn't put her hands on her head. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver flash drive that contained the photos from the lab. She held it up, the metal glinting in the spotlight. She knew they could kill her. They could bury her in the sand and tell the world she was a casualty of the breach, a hero who had died in the line of duty. But she also knew that Miller was out there, and she knew that the colonel was watching the sensors. She looked into the white light and smiled. It was a cold, hard smile, the smile of a woman who had finally found the piece that didn't fit. You're late, she whispered. The Bradley's ramp dropped with a heavy asterisk thud asterisk. A group of men in full mop level 4 gear stepped out, their masks making them look like monsters from another world. They moved toward her with rhythmic, robotic precision. Elena didn't flinch. She watched them, her eyes tracing the subtle vibration of their gear, the way the air moved around their suits. She knew exactly who they were, and she knew exactly what they were afraid of. They weren't afraid of the agent. They weren't afraid of the breach. They were afraid of her. As the first soldier reached out to grab her, the radio in his ear crackled to life. It wasn't a command from the hub. It wasn't an order from the general. It was a frequency they hadn't used in 40 years. This is Colonel Miller, the voice said, echoing over the desert. Stand down. I repeat, stand down. Specialist Vance is under my direct protection. Any hostile action against her will be considered an act of treason against the United States Army. The soldiers froze. The spotlight wavered. Elena looked past the soldiers toward the dark horizon. She saw a single pair of headlights approaching from the west. Miller. She took a step forward, the salt crust crunching under her boot. The audit is finished, she said, her voice carrying through the cold night air. She walked past the soldiers, past the Bradley, toward the approaching lights. She didn't look back to see if they were following. She didn't have to. She knew the rules of the world now. Machines didn't lie, but people did. And from now on, she was the only one who knew the difference. She reached the edge of the road as Miller's truck pulled up. He didn't say a word. He just opened the door. Elena climbed in and sat in the broken seat. The smell of dirty fuel and old dog was the best thing she had ever encountered. Where to? Miller asked, his voice shaking. Elena looked at the flash drive in her hand. She thought about the Odyssey test. She thought about the thousands of people sleeping in the barracks. The airfield, she said. The airfield? Vance, we can't get a plane. We aren't getting a plane, Elena said. She looked at the blinking lights of the base in the distance. We're going to find the man who's supposed to be flying the samples out at dawn. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. And then we're going to tell him he's got a leak. The truck roared to life, the dirty fuel injector stuttering for a second before catching. They pulled away from the lights of the Bradley, heading deeper into the dark. Elena felt the vibration of the road, the steady, rhythmic hum of a world that was finally making sense. The cost had been high. She had lost her career, her safety, and the only world she had ever known. But as the truck sped across the desert, Elena Vance realized she had gained something much more valuable. She had gained the truth. And the truth, she realized, was the only thing that never failed. She looked out the window at the passing stars. They were bright and cold and perfectly aligned. Miller, yeah, Vance, check the oil when we get there. It sounds thin. Miller let out a short bark of a laugh, the sound of a man who was finally home. Copy that, specialist, copy that. They drove into the night, two ghosts in a world of secrets, heading toward a dawn that would change everything. But as they reached the perimeter of the airfield, Elena saw something that made her blood run cold. The runway wasn't empty. There were 6 black transport planes lined up, their engines already idling, and standing on the tarmac, surrounded by a sea of soldiers, was a man she had never seen before, a man in a civilian suit, holding a briefcase that was chained to his wrist. He wasn't looking at the planes. He was looking directly at the road. He was waiting for her. Elena gripped the flash drive until the metal bit into her palm. "Stop the truck," she whispered. "What? Why?" "Because we aren't the only ones who know how to read a map," Elena said. She looked at the man in the suit. He raised a hand in a slow, mocking wave, and then every light on the airfield went red. The red strobe of the airfield's emergency lights hit the salt-stained windshield of the Humvee. Everyone. 2 seconds, casting a rhythmic, bloody glow over Miller's white knuckles, and the silver flash drive Elena held like a holy relic. The man in the charcoal suit stood 300 yards away on the tarmac, his silhouette perfectly still against the roaring backdrop of 6 C-130 Hercules transport planes, their 4-bladed propellers churning the desert air into a hurricane of grit and JP-8 fumes. This was the moment the scale tipped, the exact second where the theoretical betrayal of a few bureaucrats turned into a logistical reality, involving 300 tons of heavy-lift aircraft and a payload that could ghost a medium-sized city. Elena could feel the vibration of the engines through the floorboards, a heavy, syncopated thrum that told her the planes were at full combat power, their brakes the only thing holding them to the earth. "Vance," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical scream of the flight line. "That's Sterling, Undersecretary of Defense for Special Programs. If he's on the tarmac, this isn't a cover-up anymore. It's an extraction." Elena didn't look at Miller. She was looking at the Hercules closest to them, tail number 74 to 012. She wasn't seeing the olive-drab fuselage or the American flag painted on the vertical stabilizer. She was seeing the way the left outboard engine's cowling was vibrating at a frequency 3 hertz higher than the others. She was seeing the faint, oily shimmer of a hydraulic leak near the rear cargo ramp. To Elena, the world was a collection of tolerances and failure points, a grand machine that was always screaming its secrets to anyone who knew how to listen. "They aren't just extracting the data, Miller," Elena said, her voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "Look at the atmospheric dispersal pods on the wings. Those aren't standard. Those are the Mark 7 spray arrays from the 1980s, retrofitted with modern servos." Miller squinted through the windshield. "What are you saying?" "The test isn't over," Elena said. She opened the door of the Humvee. The heat from the engines hit her like a physical blow, a wall of dry, kerosene-scented air that made her eyes sting. The breach in B-wing was the calibration. These planes are the deployment. They're going to saturate the corridor between here and the coast to see how the agent interacts with high-altitude moisture. "That's thousands of people, Vance. That's the whole damn state." "Not if they don't take off," Elena said. She stepped out into the red light. Her body felt like it was made of glass and piano wire. The electrical arc from the generator had left a jagged, blistering burn across her left shoulder, and her vision was swimming with dark spots. But the controlled rage was a cold, stabilizing anchor in her gut. She began to walk towards Sterling. She didn't run. She didn't seek cover. She walked with the measured, terrifying gait of a woman who had already calculated the cost of the next 5 minutes and found it acceptable. The MPs in mop gear moved to intercept her, their M4s raised to the high-ready position. They were ghosts in charcoal-lined suits, their gas masks giving them the vacant, bulbous eyes of insects. Elena didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She watched the lead MP, a staff sergeant based on the insignia on his helmet. She saw the way his weight was distributed. He was hesitant. He didn't want to shoot a woman in a gray sweatshirt who looked like she'd just crawled out of a car wreck. Specialist Vance. Sterling's voice carried over the roar, amplified by a megaphone held by an aide. You have the drive. That's the only reason you're still breathing. Bring it here and we can talk about your future. There is a way out of this where you're a patriot and not a casualty. Elena stopped 20 feet from the line of MPs. The prop wash was so strong it threatened to knock her over, but she braced her boots against the concrete. She held the flash drive up between her thumb and forefinger. You're using Viking gaskets on the dispersal pods, aren't you, Mr. Sterling? She shouted. The man in the suit didn't flinch, but his aide shifted his feet. It was a tell, a small mechanical crack in the facade. The Viking series was designed for static containment, not high-vibration flight environments. Elena continued, her voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. At 30,000 feet, with the temperature drop and the engine resonance, those gaskets are going to shatter. You won't be dispersing the agent over the target. You'll be venting it directly into the cargo bays of these planes. Your pilots will be dead before they clear the salt flats. She's lying, the aide yelled, looking at Sterling. The specs were verified. Verified by Harrison? Elena asked, her eyes fixed on Sterling. He couldn't even keep a door sealed on the ground. You think he got the math right for a C-130 at Mach 0.6? She saw it then, the flicker of doubt in Sterling's eyes. It was a beautiful, jagged thing. He wasn't a soldier. He was a man who lived in the world of spreadsheets, and she had just introduced a variable he couldn't account for. Check the vibration logs for tail 012. Elena commanded, her voice dropping into a register of pure authority that made the lead MP instinctively lower his rifle an inch. Listen to the number 3 engine. That high-pitched whine, that's the harmonic resonance hitting the seal housing. It's already failing. Sterling looked at the plane, then back at Elena. If you're right, we'll adjust the mission, but the drive stays with us. I'm not right because I'm guessing, Elena said, taking a step forward. The MPs tightened their grips, but they didn't fire. I'm right because I can hear it. I can feel the failure happening in the ground under my feet, and if you let those planes take off, you aren't just a murderer. You're a failure. And I know men like you, Sterling. You can live with being a monster, but you can't live with being wrong. Secure her, Sterling barked, the doubt curdling into a desperate, panicked aggression. Now, get that drive. The lead MP stepped forward, his hand reaching for Elena's throat. Elena moved. It wasn't a flurry of cinematic martial arts. It was a single, precise application of kinetic energy. She grabbed the MP's wrist, using his own forward momentum to pivot him. She didn't strike him. She touched a pressure point she knew was vulnerable because of the way his tactical vest was riding too high on his neck. He went down with a muffled grunt, his rifle clattering to the tarmac. Elena didn't pick up the gun. She didn't need it. She broke into a sprint, not toward Sterling, but toward the fueling pit 20 yards to her right. Fire! Sterling screamed. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of sound and light. The MPs opened fire, the muzzle flashes strobing against the red emergency lights. Elena felt a sharp, searing pain in her side, a grazing shot, nothing more, but she didn't slow down. She dived behind the heavy steel housing of the fuel manifold. Bullets sparked off the metal, the asterisk ping-ping-ping asterisk of lead on steel, a terrifyingly fast rhythm. She could smell the raw JP-8 now, the scent of high-octane potential energy. She looked at the manifold. It was an old Peerless brand system, heavy on mechanical overrides and light on digital security. It was a beautiful piece of 1970s engineering, built to survive a nuclear strike. She reached into the housing, her fingers finding the manual bypass valve. Vance, get out of there! Miller was screaming from the Humvee. He had pulled a sidearm and was firing back at the MPs, providing just enough distraction to keep them from swarming her position. Elena ignored him. She was listening to the manifold. She could hear the fuel rushing through the underground pipes, a heavy liquid pulse. She knew the pressure was at 80 psi. If she could spike it to 120, she could trigger the emergency shut-off valves in the plane's wings. It was a safety feature designed to prevent fires during refueling, but if triggered during an engine run, it would starve the turbines instantly. She gripped the valve handle. It was rusted, the metal biting into her palms. She pulled, nothing. She braced her feet against the concrete and pulled again, her muscles screaming, the wound in her side leaking warm blood down her hip. Asterisk, come on, asterisk, she hissed through gritted teeth. Asterisk, give it to me. Asterisk, the valve groaned, a slow, metallic protest. Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the interior of the pipe. She felt the moment the seal broke, a sudden, violent release of tension. The handle spun. Above her, the roar of the C-130s changed. It went from a steady scream to a series of ragged, coughing stutters. "What did you do?" Sterling's voice was a shriek now, lost in the mechanical death rattle of the aircraft. One by one, the massive propellers began to slow. The number 3 engine on tail 012 let out a violent backfire, a plume of blue flame shooting 10 feet out of the exhaust before the turbine seized with a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of lead. Elena leaned her back against the manifold, her chest heaving. She was covered in grease, salt, and blood. Her vision was narrowing, the world turning into a long, dark tunnel with a red strobe at the end of it. The silence that followed was more deafening than the engines had been. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, lonely howl of the desert wind. She heard footsteps. Heavy rhythmic, the MPs were closing in. "Don't move," a voice said. It wasn't the staff sergeant. It was someone higher up. Elena opened her eyes. Sterling was standing over her, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. He looked down at her not as a human being, but as a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned so badly it had destroyed his entire career. "You have no idea what you've done," Sterling whispered. "That payload was worth $4 billion. The data from this flight was the cornerstone of our defense strategy for the next decade." Elena looked up at him. She spat a mouthful of blood onto the shiny toe of his Italian leather shoes. "The data was a lie," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Your gaskets failed. If they'd taken off, they would have crashed in the middle of Salt Lake City. I didn't just stop a test, Sterling. I saved your life, not that you deserve it." Sterling raised his hand. For a second, Elena thought he was going to hit her. Instead, he turned to the MPs. "Kill her," he said. He said it the way someone orders a coffee. "And the corporal in the truck. Make it look like they tried to sabotage the fuel pits. Total containment breach. We'll burn the bodies with the rest of the waste." The MPs hesitated. These weren't the black ops shadows from the lab. These were base security, kids from Ohio and Texas and Florida who had joined the army to pay for college or see the world. They looked at Elena, then at each other. "Sir?" the staff sergeant asked, his voice trembling. "The colonel's radio call." He said she was under protection. "The colonel is being relieved of command as we speak," Sterling said, stepping back. "I am the civilian authority here. Do your duty, Sergeant." The sergeant looked at Elena. She looked back at him, her eyes steady, her breathing controlled. She didn't beg. She didn't ask for mercy. She simply waited for the machine of the state to finish what it had started. "I can't do that, sir," the sergeant said. Sterling froze. "What did you say?" "I said I can't do that," the sergeant repeated, his voice growing stronger. He lowered his rifle. Around him, the other 4 MPs followed suit. "This isn't a combat zone, and she isn't an enemy combatant. She's a specialist in the United States Army." "This is a direct order," Sterling screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. "It's an unlawful order, sir," the sergeant said. He looked at Elena and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "Specialist Vance, are you injured?" "I've been better," Elena said, her voice cracking. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. The sergeant caught her, his heavy, gloved hands steadying her. For a moment, there was a pure human connection, the shared understanding between 2 people who had been asked to break themselves for a lie and had finally chosen to stay whole. "We need a medic," the sergeant shouted, but the moment of reprieve was short-lived. From the far end of the airfield, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the scream of a siren. It was a low, heavy rumble that vibrated in the soles of Elena's boots. She knew that sound. It was the sound of armor. 3 M1A2 Abrams tanks were rolling out of the darkness of Hangar 4, their massive 120 cannons leveled at the fuel pits. Behind them, a company of infantry in full combat gear moved in a flawless, terrifying skirmish line. This wasn't base security. This was the quick reaction force from the North Perimeter. The ones who didn't know Elena, didn't know the sergeant, and only knew that there had been a Tier 1 sabotage event at the airfield. Sterling saw them and his face transformed. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, triumphant sneer. "The QRF is under my direct authorization," he said, looking at the sergeant. "You and your men are now officially accomplices. I'd suggest you drop your weapons before the tanks decide to clear the tarmac for us." The sergeant looked at the approaching tanks, then at Elena. The odds were no longer impossible, they were non-existent. A squad of MPs with small arms against a line of main battle tanks was a slaughter waiting for a reason to start. "Vance," Miller hissed, appearing at her side. He had abandoned the Humvee and was crouching low. "We have to go. Now. The perimeter fence is only half a mile away." We won't make it, Elena said. She looked at the tanks. She was calculating the reload time of an Abrams, the traverse speed of the turret, the thermal signature of the fuel manifold. They'll light us up before we hit the scrub. She looked at the silver flash drive in her hand. It felt heavy now. It felt like a curse. Miller, she said, her voice barely a breath. Give me your lighter. What? Vance, no. The lighter, Miller, now. He handed it to her, a battered Zippo with a faded 1st Infantry Division crest on it. Elena flicked it open. The flame was small, orange, and fragile against the vast darkness of the desert. She looked at Sterling. You want the drive? She asked. She held the drive over the open fuel port of the manifold. A single drop of JP-8 was clinging to the rim. If I drop this, Elena said, her voice echoing with a terrifying, dark competence, the spark from this lighter will hit the vapor in this manifold. This fueling station is connected to the central reservoir. You won't just lose the drive, Sterling. You'll lose the airfield, you'll lose the planes, and you'll lose the evidence of what you were trying to do. Sterling stopped. The QRF was still 500 yards out, but the tanks had slowed, their commanders likely seeing the situation through their thermal sights. A woman with a lighter standing over an open fuel manifold was a broken arrow event in the making. You're bluffing, Sterling said, though his voice lacked conviction. You'd be the first to die. I've been dead since I walked into B-Wing, Elena said. She stepped closer to the port, the flame of the Zippo dancing inches from the volatile fumes. The difference is, I know what I'm dying for, do you? For 30 seconds the world stopped spinning. The only sound was the idling of the tanks and the heavy, ragged breathing of the men on the tarmac. The tension was a physical weight, a cord stretched so tight it was humming. Elena's hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't blink. She was a statue of salt and fire, the final failure point in a system that had tried to bypass humanity. Wait, Sterling shouted, his hands raised. Wait, let's negotiate. There is no negotiation, Elena said. Tell the QRF to stand down, tell them to return to the barracks, and then you're going to get on one of those planes, the one that isn't broken, and you're going to leave this base. Alone. I can't do that, Sterling said. The mission ended the second I heard your gaskets failing, Elena interrupted. Now call them off or we all go up together. Sterling looked at the tanks, then at the girl in the gray sweatshirt. He saw the truth in her eyes, the terrifying, uncompromising truth of a person who has lost everything and found themselves in the wreckage. He pulled a radio from his pocket. All units, this is Sterling. Stand down. Return to your stations. This is a controlled exercise. I repeat, stand down. The tanks slowed, their turrets rotating back to the center. The infantry line halted, the soldiers looking at each other in confusion before beginning a disciplined withdrawal. Sterling looked at Elena. You think you've won, but you're still in the middle of the desert, Vance. You have no friends, no career, no future. I'll be back with a warrant before the sun comes up. I'll be waiting, Elena said. She didn't move until Sterling and his aides had boarded a small civilian transport jet at the far end of the runway. She watched the jet taxi, its lights shrinking into the distance until it was just another star in the Utah sky. When it was finally gone, she closed the Zippo. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was clean. Elena slumped against the manifold, the adrenaline leaving her body in a sudden, violent rush. She felt the cold of the desert night finally penetrating her skin. She felt the pain in her side, the throb in her shoulder, the exhaustion that went all the way to her marrow. Miller knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Vance, Elena, we have to move, the colonel. He's still on the radio. He's got a transport waiting at the north gate. He's taking us to the federal site in 2L. We're going to give the drive to the JAG. Elena looked at him. Miller, the Georgia boy who had stayed when the air turned to poison. She reached out and took his hand. His grip was warm, solid, and real. Did we do it, Miller? She asked, her voice a fragile thing. We did it, he said, a small smile breaking through the grime on his face. You did it. You broke the machine. No, Elena said, looking at the dark, silent C-130s on the tarmac. I just told it the truth. They walked away from the airfield, two small figures against the vast, shimmering expanse of the salt flats. The red lights were still strobing, but the emergency was over. Elena felt the weight of the drive in her pocket. It was the cost of her life as she knew it. It was the end of her career, her anonymity, and her safety. But as she looked toward the horizon, where the first faint hint of gray was beginning to touch the sky, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a soldier. They reached the north gate an hour later. The colonel was there, standing beside a black SUV. He didn't have a weapon and he didn't have a suit. He was just a man in a rumpled uniform who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked at Elena, his eyes scanning the blood and the grease and the hard, controlled set of her jaw. He didn't offer a medal, he didn't offer a promotion, he just opened the door. "Specialist Vance," he said, his voice thick with a respect that had been earned in the dark. "Sir," Elena replied. She climbed into the back seat. As the SUV pulled away from the West Desert Test Center, Elena looked out the rear window. She saw the towers, the fences, the bunkers where the secrets were kept. She saw the mountain of dirt that had tried to bury her. She reached into her pocket and touched the drive one last time. The world was still a machine. It was still loud, still violent, and still prone to failure. But Elena Vance wasn't a gear anymore. She wasn't a variable. She was the mechanic. And as the sun finally broke over the edge of the desert, she closed her eyes and let herself breathe the one thing she had fought so hard to save. The air was cold. It was sharp. And for the first time in a long time, it was pure. She slept as the SUV sped toward the city, her head resting against the cold glass. She didn't dream of the gas or the fire or the screaming men. She dreamed of a small house in the mountains, of a dog that didn't care about gaskets or protocols, and of a morning where she could wake up and not have to listen for the sound of something breaking. The reckoning was coming. The lawyers, the boards of inquiry, the men in suits who would try to turn her into a ghost. She knew it was all waiting for her at the end of this road. But as the light of the new day filled the car, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. They could take her rank. They could take her freedom. But they could never take what she had found in the basement of Building 104. She was right. And in a world built on lies, that was the only victory that mattered. The SUV turned onto the main highway, merging with the early morning traffic of people heading to work, to school, to lives that would never know her name. Elena watched them pass, a sea of faces that were safe because of a woman they would never meet. She leaned back and closed her eyes. The mission was over, and for now that was enough. The plastic chair in the observation room at Fort Douglas had a hairline fracture in the left rear leg that clicked every time Elena Vance shifted her weight. A tiny, rhythmic snap that echoed the countdown of the digital clock on the wall. It was 0400 on a Tuesday, exactly 72 hours since she had stood over an open fuel manifold in the Utah desert with a Zippo lighter and the weight of $4 billion of failed government engineering in her hand. The room smelled of ozone, industrial-strength floor wax, and the stale, bitter scent of the coffee the major across the table had been nursing for 3 hours. Elena didn't touch her own cup. She didn't need the caffeine to stay awake. The phantom hum of the C-130 engines was still vibrating in her teeth, a lingering frequency that her mind refused to let go of. She sat with her hands folded on the laminate surface, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of bored professional compliance. Under the sleeve of her fresh olive-drab flight suit, the bandage on her shoulder was pulling at the jagged, angry blisters left by the electrical arc in Building 104. But she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that in rooms like this, any sign of pain was just another data point for the people trying to figure out how to break you. Major Holloway of the Criminal Investigation Division turned a page in the thick manila folder between them. The sound of the paper sliding against paper was, to Elena's ears, as loud as a shovel scraping across gravel. Holloway was 45, with a soft middle that his starched class BTKS couldn't entirely hide, and a wedding ring that he kept twisting with his thumb. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who liked rules, and Elena was a woman who had just shattered every rule in the book to prevent a catastrophe that, officially, was never supposed to be possible. "Specialist Vance, I've spent the last 12 hours reading the technical specs of the Viking gaskets," Holloway said, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. He didn't look up. "Our engineers at Wright-Patterson say that while the vibration thresholds were near their limit, the catastrophic failure you predicted was statistically unlikely. They're calling it a conservative estimation error on your part." "Statistically unlikely is not the same as impossible, Major," Elena said. Her voice was flat, a tool she used with the same precision she used a torque wrench. At 30,000 feet, the ambient temperature drops to -40. The thermal contraction of the housing increases the gap by 0.004 inches. The resonance from the number 3 engine at 70% throttle creates a standing wave. The gaskets didn't just leak. They disintegrated. If those planes had reached cruising altitude, the dispersal would have occurred internally. You would have had 6 crews dead within 90 seconds. Holloway finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and for a fleeting second, Elena saw the flicker of something that wasn't suspicion. It was the look a man gives a storm he can't navigate. But they didn't take off, because you sabotaged a multi-billion-dollar mission and held a civilian Undersecretary of Defense at bay with a threat of domestic terrorism. I prevented a Tier 1 chemical contamination of the Salt Lake Basin, Elena corrected. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The truth was its own volume. The fact that Mr. Sterling finds that inconvenient is a matter for his ego, not the UCMJ. The Army doesn't see it that way, specialist. Right now, there is a draft of a general court-martial sitting on the colonel's desk. They are looking at destruction of government property, assault on a superior officer, and multiple counts of insubordination. They want to make you disappear into Leavenworth for 20 years. Elena leaned forward just enough to let the chair leg click once more. The sound was sharp in the silent room. They can draft whatever they want, but they won't file it, because if they go to trial, I get to call witnesses. I get to call the engineers who signed off on those gaskets. I get to call the logistics officers who bypassed the safety protocols for the dispersal arrays. And I get to call Mr. Sterling. Do you think the Pentagon wants a public record of why a biological agent was being loaded onto uncertified aircraft for a test over a civilian corridor? Holloway went back to twisting his ring. He knew she was right. That was the problem with people like Elena Vance. They were never more dangerous than when they were right at the wrong time. The institution didn't know how to handle her. She wasn't a whistleblower in the traditional sense. She was a mechanic who had looked at a broken machine and refused to let it run. In the military, that was called loyalty to the mission. In the world of high-level defense contracts, it was called a liability. The door behind Holloway opened, and a man in a charcoal suit walked in. He wasn't Sterling. This man was older, with silver hair and the kind of quiet, predatory stillness that came from decades of navigating the shadows of the Beltway. He didn't introduce himself. He just sat down in the chair next to the major and laid a single sheet of paper on the table. "Specialist Vance," the man said. His voice was smooth like expensive scotch. "My name is Miller's problem. Or rather, I am the reason Miller is currently being processed for an honorable discharge with full benefits instead of being hauled in front of a board of inquiry." Elena's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. Miller, the boy from Georgia who had stood by her when the world turned red. She hadn't seen him since they arrived at the gate in 2L. They had separated them immediately, putting her in this sterile isolation and taking him somewhere she couldn't track. "Is he okay?" she asked. It was the first time she had asked a question that wasn't about the mechanics of the failure. "Corporal Miller is fine," the man said. "He's currently at Hill Air Force Base, finishing his out-processing. He's being given a generous severance package and a very strict non-disclosure agreement. He's going back to his family in Savannah. He'll never have to work a day in his life if he's smart with the money." The cost of silence. Elena felt a cold, hollow weight settle in her chest. They were buying him, and because Miller was a good man who believed in the system until it tried to kill him, he would take the deal. He would go home, and he would carry the secret of the Utah desert like a stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. "And me?" Elena asked. "You're a different story," the man said, leaning back. "You're not motivated by money. You're not even motivated by a sense of self-preservation. You're motivated by the fact that you can't stand a machine that doesn't work. That makes you very difficult to buy and very dangerous to keep." He tapped the paper on the table. It was a transfer order. No, not a transfer. It was a deletion. As of 0600 this morning, Specialist Elena Vance no longer exists in the United States Army Personnel Database. You are being officially listed as discharged for medical reasons effective immediately. There will be no court-martial. There will be no medals. There will be no record of your time at the West Desert Test Center. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a collapse. Elena looked at the paper. It was a clean erase. They weren't punishing her with a cell. They were punishing her with invisibility. They were taking the one thing she had, her identity as a soldier, her place in the machine, and throwing it into the shredder. "The injury to your shoulder," the man continued, his voice devoid of empathy. "We're classifying it as a training accident. You'll receive a disability rating of 30%. Enough to pay for your physical therapy, but not enough to cause any questions. You'll be driven to the airport in 2 hours. You have a one-way ticket to whatever city you choose, as long as it's at least 3 states away from Utah." Elena felt the rage then. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a younger woman. It was the cold, pressurized rage of a person who had given everything to an institution and watched it turn its back on the truth to save its own skin. She looked at the man in the suit, and for the first time she let the controls slip just a fraction, just enough for him to see the fire behind her eyes. "What about the gaskets?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "What about the planes? Are you still going to fly them?" The man in the suit didn't blink. "The program has been paused for evaluation. Mr. Sterling has been reassigned to a post in the Pacific. The payload has been returned to secure storage." A pause, not a cancellation, a reassignment, not a dismissal. The machine was repairing itself, sealing the leaks and moving on. They hadn't learned anything. They had just moved the failure point to a location where Elena Vance couldn't hear it. "You can't hide the math forever," Elena said. "Eventually, something else will break, and next time there won't be anyone there to catch the fuel." "That's a risk we're prepared to take," the man said, standing up. "Major Holloway will escort you to the medical wing for your final checkout. Your belongings are in a box in the hallway. I suggest you don't look back, specialist. The desert is a big place. It swallows things much larger than you." He walked out without a second look. Major Holloway stood up, his face a map of conflicted emotions. He looked like he wanted to say something, an apology, a thank you, a warning, but the weight of his uniform kept the words trapped in his throat. He just gestured toward the door. Elena stood. Her legs felt heavy, as if she were walking through deep water. She stepped out into the hallway and saw the cardboard box sitting on a bench. In it was her civilian life, a pair of jeans, a gray sweatshirt, a cell phone with a dead battery, and the silver Zippo Miller had given her. She picked up the lighter. It felt cold in her hand. She flicked the lid open. The smell of lighter fluid and burnt wick filled her nose, a sharp, metallic memory of the tarmac. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a part that had been removed from an engine and left on the floor, functional but useless without the rest of the machine. The medical wing was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. A young nurse, a captain who looked like she hadn't slept in 48 hours, changed the dressing on Elena's shoulder. The burn was a jagged, purple mess, a permanent map of the day Elena had touched the third rail. It would never fully heal. The skin would always be tight, always a reminder of the cost of being right. "This is going to scar," the captain said, her voice soft. She didn't ask how it happened. She knew better. "You'll have limited range of motion for a few months. Use the cream, keep it out of the sun." "I've had worse," Elena said. "I doubt it," the captain replied, meeting her eyes for a split second. In that moment, Elena saw it, the sisterhood of the overlooked. The nurse saw the soldier in Elena, even if the paperwork said she didn't exist anymore. "Good luck, Vance." Elena walked out of the hospital wing and into the cool, morning air of Salt Lake City. The sun was just beginning to hit the tops of the Wasatch Mountains, turning the peaks a pale, dusty rose. It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning people in the valley woke up to and thought the world was a safe, predictable place. They didn't know about the C-130s. They didn't know about the gaskets. They didn't know about the woman standing on the sidewalk with a cardboard box and a hole in her history. A black sedan was waiting at the curb. The driver was an MP, a kid no older than 20. He didn't look at her as he opened the trunk for her box. He was a cog doing what he was told, moving the piece from point A to point B. "Airport, ma'am?" he asked. "Yeah," Elena said. "Airport." As they drove through the quiet streets, Elena watched the city wake up. She saw a father walking his dog. She saw a woman jogging. She saw the mundane, beautiful rhythm of civilian life. It felt alien to her. For 6 years, her world had been measured in decibels and tolerances in the language of the machine. Now the machine had spit her out. She thought of Miller. She hoped he was on a plane to Georgia. She hoped he could find a way to live with the money and the silence. He was young enough that he might be able to forget the sound of the number 3 engine failing. He might be able to look at a C-130 in the sky and not see a coffin. Elena knew she would never have that luxury. Every time she heard a plane, she would be calculating the vibration. Every time she smelled kerosene, she would be looking for the leak. The airport was a chaotic mess of travelers, a sea of people who were all going somewhere for reasons that seemed trivial to her. She checked in for her flight to Seattle, a city she had chosen at random because it was as far away from the desert as she could get without leaving the country. She sat at the gate, her box at her feet, and watched the digital board flip through the flights. "Elena." The voice was quiet, hesitant. Elena turned. Miller was standing 10 feet away. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a plaid shirt and a baseball cap, looking like every other 20-something guy in the terminal. but his eyes were the same, tired, haunted, and sharp. Elena stood up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was more than the 10 feet of terminal carpet. It was the weight of everything they couldn't say. "They told me you were already gone," Miller said. He looked at the cardboard box. "They're shipping me out to Atlanta in an hour." "I heard," Elena said. "The honorable discharge, the package. You should take it, Miller. Go home, buy that farm you're always talking about." Miller stepped closer, his jaw tightened. "They tried to make me sign a statement, Elena. They wanted me to say you were unstable, that the sabotage was a mental breakdown." Elena felt the cold spike of betrayal, but she didn't let it reach her face. "And I didn't sign it," Miller said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. It wasn't a statement. It was a copy of the maintenance log from tail number 74 to 012. The original log that Elena had seen in the hangar, the one with the red-lined entries about the vibration. But this one had something else. At the bottom in the margins, someone had scrawled a series of initials. R.S. Robert Sterling. "I swiped it from the colonel's office while they were processing my paperwork," Miller whispered. "He had it in a shredder pile. It's the proof, Elena. He knew. He knew the gaskets were failing before they even fueled the planes." Elena looked at the paper. The ink was a death sentence. If this got out, it wasn't just a mission failure. It was a criminal conspiracy. It was the lever she needed to break the people who had tried to erase her. "Why are you giving this to me?" Elena asked, her voice a whisper. "If they find out you have this, the deal is gone. You'll be in a cell before you hit the tarmac in Atlanta." Miller looked at her, and for the first time, Elena saw the boy from Georgia grow up. "Because you were right. And because they can't just make you go away like you never mattered. You saved those crews, Elena. You saved this whole damn state. If I take the money and stay quiet, I'm just another part of the machine that broke." He reached out and squeezed her hand. His grip was steady. "Don't let them win, even if it costs us everything. Don't let them be right." "Miller." "Go," he said, backing away as his flight was called over the intercom. "They're watching us. Just go." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, a small, brave figure heading toward a life of quiet secrets. Elena stood alone at the gate, the paper clutched in her hand. The weight of it was immense. It was a weapon, and it was a burden. She sat back down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the paper, then at the box of her life. She was a woman with no name, no rank, and a permanent scar on her shoulder. She was a ghost in the system, but ghosts have a way of haunting the people who made them. As she boarded her plane, Elena felt the shift inside her. The controlled rage was still there, but it had a new shape now. It was no longer a shield, it was a purpose. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was the one who was going to make sure the machine finally had to account for its failures. The flight to Seattle was 6 hours of hum and vibration. Elena sat by the window, her eyes closed, listening to the plane. She could hear the rhythmic pulse of the turbines, the slight whistle of the air over the wing flaps, the click of the landing gear as it tucked into the fuselage. She knew this plane was safe. She knew the math was sound. But she also knew that somewhere, in another hangar, in another desert, someone was signing off on a gasket that wouldn't hold. Someone was making a calculation that traded lives for a decimal point. She arrived in Seattle in a cold, gray drizzle. The city was a forest of steel and glass, a place where people disappeared into the mist. She checked into a cheap motel near the waterfront, the kind of place that didn't ask for a credit card and had the faint smell of old cigarettes and salt air. She sat on the edge of the bed and spread the maintenance log out on the small desk. Beside it, she placed her phone and the silver Zippo. She looked at the initials, R.S., Robert Sterling. The institutional response had been to bury her. They had used the machinery of the state to protect the men who had failed. They had turned the truth into a medical discharge and a training accident. They thought they had closed the loop. Elena picked up her phone. It was an old model, not encrypted, but she knew how to work the signal. She had learned a lot of things in the basement of Building 104, things that weren't in her personnel file. She knew how to find the people who were looking for the things the government wanted to hide. She knew how to make a frequency carry a message that couldn't be intercepted. She spent the next 3 days in that motel room. She didn't leave except to get food from the vending machine. She worked with the same meticulous mechanical focus she had used on the C-130s. She traced the contracts for the Viking gaskets. She found the subcontractors, the lobbyists, the paper trail of money that led from Sterling's office to a manufacturing plant in Ohio that had been cited for safety violations 3 times in 5 years. She was building a different kind of machine now, A machine made of facts, dates, and signatures. A machine that, once set in motion, would be impossible to stop. On the fourth day, there was a knock at the door. Elena didn't move. She reached for the Zippo on the desk, her fingers closing around the metal. She listened. The person on the other side of the door was heavy, their breathing shallow, one person, wearing boots. She stood up and walked to the door, her back against the wall. "Who is it? Specialist Vance?" The voice was familiar, but it took her a second to place it. It wasn't Miller. It wasn't Holloway. She opened the door. Staff Sergeant Davis, the MP from the tarmac, was standing in the hallway. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a hooded sweatshirt and jeans, and his face was pale, his eyes darting to the ends of the corridor. "How did you find me?" Elena asked, her voice like ice. "Miller," Davis said, his voice trembling. "He called me before he left for Georgia. He said you might need help. He said the machine was still running." Elena looked at him. This was the man who had refused to shoot her, the man who had stood between her and the tanks. He was a good soldier, a man who believed in the oath, and now he was standing in a cheap motel in Seattle, looking like he was waiting for the world to end. "Why are you here, Davis?" "They're coming for the log," he whispered. "Sterling." He found out it was missing. They're tracking the phone pings. "They know you're in the city." Elena felt a cold chill wash over her. She had been careful, but she wasn't invisible. No one was invisible to a man like Sterling when his life was on the line. "I have the proof, Davis," she said, stepping back to let him in. "I have the signatures. If I can get this to the right people, it's over." "The right people don't exist, Vance," Davis said, closing the door behind him. He looked at the desk, at the papers spread out like a battle map. "The people you want to give this to are the people who hired Sterling. They aren't going to fix the machine. They're just going to replace the part that's leaking, and right now, that's you." Elena looked at the maintenance log. She looked at the initials RS. She thought of the 240 men on those planes. She thought of the people in the valley who would have breathed in the failure. "Then I'll find a different way," she said. "There is no other way," Davis said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted thumb drive. "Miller gave me this too. He said it was the backup of the dispersal data, the stuff you pulled from the lab." Elena took the drive. It was cold, the metal biting into her palm. She looked at it, then at Davis. "They're going to kill you for this," she said. "They already killed me," Davis said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "They relieved me of my post. They are investigating me for extremist ties. I'm done, Vance, but you're the only one who knows how the machine works. You're the only one who can actually break it." He looked at the door. "I have a car downstairs. We have to move, now." Elena didn't hesitate. She gathered the papers, the drive, and her few belongings. She felt the weight of the moment, the final transition. She was no longer a soldier. She was no longer a ghost. She was the failure point in a system that thought it was indestructible. As they walked down the stairs to the parking lot, Elena looked at the gray Seattle sky. The rain was coming down harder now, a cold, relentless drizzle that washed the city clean. She felt the pain in her shoulder, the sharp, pulling reminder of the cost. She climbed into the passenger seat of the nondescript sedan. Davis started the engine, the low hum of the motor a familiar comfort. He pulled out of the lot and merged into the traffic, heading toward the heart of the city. "Where are we going?" Davis asked. Elena looked at the thumb drive in her hand. She thought of the woman she had been 6 months ago, a specialist who just wanted to do her job and keep the planes flying. She thought of the woman she was now. "We're going to the one place they can't reach," she said. "Where's that?" Elena looked at the reflection of the city in the window. The truth. She knew what was coming. She knew the lawyers would be waiting. She knew the men in suits would be watching. She knew that the reckoning she was about to trigger would be loud, violent, and permanent. But as they drove through the rain, Elena Vance felt a strange, quiet peace. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She was just the mechanic, and she had one last job to do. The car turned onto the highway, heading north. Elena leaned back and closed her eyes, the sound of the tires on the wet pavement a steady, rhythmic pulse. She could hear the world breaking. She could hear the cracks forming in the dam. She could hear the gears grinding to a halt. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to fix it. She wanted to watch it burn. The personal cost was high. She had lost her career, her safety, and her future. She had a scar that would never go away and a memory that would never fade. She had lost the man she had fought alongside and the institution she had loved. But as she touched the silver Zippo in her pocket, she knew she had found something more important. She had found her own voice, and she was about to use it to scream the truth until the world had no choice but to listen. The cliffhanger was no longer about survival. It was about impact. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she had memorized from a news report 3 years ago. a number that belonged to a journalist who didn't care about protocols or NDAs. A journalist who specialized in the things the government wanted to bury. The phone rang once, twice. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. Elena took a deep breath. She looked at the maintenance log. She looked at the initials RS. "My name is Elena Vance," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I was a specialist at the West Desert Test Center, and I have something you need to see." Outside, the city of Seattle roared on, a sea of people who had no idea that the world was about to change. Elena watched the lights of the buildings flicker past, each one a tiny spark in the darkness. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a victim. She was the one who knew why it was breaking, and she was finally ready to tell the story. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, a gap that Elena was about to fill with the weight of the desert. "Are you still there?" the journalist asked. Elena looked at Davis, who was watching the rearview mirror with the intensity of a man who knew he was being followed. She looked at the thumb drive. She looked at the scar on her shoulder. "I'm here," Elena said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The car sped into the night, the red taillights of the traffic ahead of them like a line of blood on the wet asphalt. The mission was no longer classified. The secret was no longer safe, and the reckoning was just beginning. Elena Vance leaned her head against the window and watched the rain wash the world away. She was tired, she was broken, and she was alone. But she was right. And as the journalist's voice came back through the line, urgent and hungry for the truth, Elena knew that the machine was finally going to have to listen to the mechanic. "Start from the beginning," the voice said. Elena closed her eyes. "It started with a gasket," she said. The story was no longer a secret. It was a weapon, and Elena Vance was the one holding the trigger. As the car disappeared into the fog of the Pacific Northwest, the weight of the desert finally began to lift. It wasn't gone, and it would never be forgotten. But for the first time since she had walked into Building 104, Elena Vance could breathe. The air was cold, it was wet, and it was finally truly her own. The reckoning for Sterling, for the Pentagon, and for the system that had tried to bury her was only a few hours away. Elena knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew they would fight back with everything they had. But she also knew something they didn't. She knew how the machine was built. She knew where the failure points were, and she knew exactly where to strike to make the whole thing come crashing down. She sat in the dark car, a ghost in a gray sweatshirt, and waited for the world to catch up to her. The institution had responded with silence. Elena was about to respond with a roar. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, she knew that the truth was the only metal she would ever need. She gripped the phone, the thumb drive, and the Zippo. She was ready. The final part of the machine was about to be installed, and this time it was going to hold. The cost was paid. The reckoning was here, and Elena Vance was the only one who could see the end of the road. She didn't look back, she didn't look forward. She just stayed in the moment, the quiet, powerful moment of a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of. The world was about to find out too, and they were never going to be the same. "It started with a gasket," Elena said, and the words felt like they were being pulled from her lungs through a filter of rusted iron. She was looking at the rain-streaked window of the sedan as they idled in the queue for the Bainbridge Island ferry. The Seattle skyline was a jagged silhouette of gray and neon, half swallowed by a low-hanging mist that smelled of salt water and wet pavement. Beside her, Staff Sergeant Davis kept his hands at 10 and 2, his knuckles white against the black leather of the steering wheel. He didn't look at her. He was watching the side mirror, tracking the headlights of a silver Tahoe that had stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind them since they left the motel. "A gasket," the voice on the other end of the line repeated. It was Sarah Thorne, a woman whose reputation for breaking the stories the Pentagon preferred to bury was built on a foundation of icy persistence. "You're telling me $4 billion of hardware and a classified biological testing program came down to a $3 piece of rubber?" "Viking gaskets aren't $3. Elena corrected, her voice flat, the precision of the mechanic overriding the exhaustion of the fugitive. "They're custom-molded polymer designed for high-altitude thermal cycling. But they were manufactured by a subcontractor in Toledo that had its quality control certification pulled twice in 2022. Sterling knew it. He authorized the bypass to keep the dispersal window on schedule. He traded the safety margin for a launch date. And you have the logs, the actual maintenance signatures. I have the red lines. I have the telemetry data from the abort. And I have the disposal manifest for the agent," Elena said. She felt the thumb drive in her pocket, a small, cold weight against her thigh. But I'm not sending them over an unsecure line. We meet in person, public, crowded. The ferry terminal? Sarah suggested. No, we're already on the boat, Elena said, watching the Tahoe pull into the lane behind them. The massive steel jaws of the ferry began to groan shut, the sound of metal on metal echoing across the water like a gunshot. Top deck, the observation lounge. You have 20 minutes until we dock on the other side. If you're not there, I'm walking. She hung up before Sarah could respond. She didn't have the luxury of negotiation. She looked at Davis. He was a good soldier, a man who had spent 10 years following orders because he believed the orders were meant to protect the person standing next to him. Now he was an accomplice to a ghost, his career a smoldering ruin in a desert he would never see again. You don't have to do this, Davis, Elena said softly. You can get out at the terminal. Tell them I hijacked the car. Tell them you were trying to talk me down. Davis finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch. I watched them load those planes, Vance. I saw the look on your face when you realized what was happening. If I walk away now, I'm just waiting for the next gasket to fail. I'd rather be on the boat when it goes down. Elena nodded once. It wasn't a gesture of thanks. It was a recognition of a shared reality. They stepped out of the car, the air on the vehicle deck cold and heavy with the scent of diesel fumes and the damp, metallic breath of the sound. The ferry began to move, a slow, rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the soles of Elena's boots. She walked toward the stairs, her movements stiff. The bandage on her shoulder felt like a hot brand, the skin underneath pulling with every step, but she didn't slow down. She had been trained to operate at a deficit. The observation lounge was nearly empty, a cavernous space of blue vinyl seats and panoramic windows that looked out into the churning gray water. A few commuters sat huddled over laptops, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens, oblivious to the fact that the woman walking past them was carrying enough data to end a dozen careers and spark a congressional inquiry. Sarah Thorne was waiting near the forward windows. She was younger than Elena expected, maybe mid-30s, wearing a beige trench coat that looked too thin for the Seattle wind. She didn't look like a crusader, she looked like an actuary. But when Elena met her eyes, she saw the same thing she saw in herself, a refusal to accept a lie just because it was convenient. Specialist Vance, Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. I'm not a specialist anymore, Elena said. She sat down across from her back to the window. She wanted to see the door. She wanted to see who came up the stairs behind them. I'm a medical discharge, a training accident, a clerical error. I've spent the last 3 hours vetting what you told me on the phone, Sarah said, leaning forward. She placed a digital recorder on the table between them. The Toledo plant, the Sterling connection, it's all there, buried under 6 layers of shell companies. But without the logs, it's just a theory. I need the proof. Elena pulled the thumb drive from her pocket and held it in the palm of her hand. The silver metal caught the flickering light of the lounge. This drive contains the telemetry from the C-130s. It shows the vibration resonance hitting the failure threshold at 12,000 feet. It shows the pressure drop in the dispersal manifold. And it shows the command override from Sterling's terminal, telling the pilots to ignore the warning lights and continue the ascent. Sarah reached for it, but Elena closed her hand. Before I give this to you, you need to understand something, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. They won't just sue you. They won't just send a cease and desist. They will try to erase the story before it hits the wire. They erased me in 48 hours. They'll do the same to you. I've been erased before, Sarah said, her jaw tightening. I work for paper that doesn't blink, and I have a legal team that eats NDAs for breakfast. Give me the drive, Elena. Let me do the job they wouldn't let you do. Elena looked past Sarah toward the stairs. 2 men had just entered the lounge. They weren't wearing uniforms, but she knew them instantly. The gate was the giveaway, the balanced, predatory walk of men who had spent their lives in boots and tactical gear. They were wearing dark, nondescript jackets, their hands tucked into their pockets. They weren't looking at the view, they were looking at her. We have a problem, Elena whispered. She didn't wait for Sarah to ask. She slid the thumb drive across the table, her movements precise and hidden by the edge of the laminate. Take it. Go to the bathroom. There's a narrow window in the 3rd stall that leads to the outer deck. Get to the lower level and wait for the boat to dock. Don't look for me. Don't look for Davis. Just get the data to your editor. Elena. Go, Elena commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a woman who had stood over a fuel manifold with a lighter. It was a voice that demanded obedience. Sarah took the drive and stood up, her face pale. She walked toward the restrooms with a practiced casualness that Elena hoped would be enough. The two men at the door didn't follow her. They stayed where they were, their eyes locked on Elena. One of them tapped his ear, a subtle movement that confirmed they were on a secure channel. Elena sat back in the vinyl seat and picked up a discarded newspaper from the table. She felt the cold clarity of a mission profile settling over her. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing becoming rhythmic and shallow. She was no longer a person, she was an obstacle, a distraction. She was the part of the machine that was designed to take the hit so the rest of the system could function. The taller of the two men approached the table. He was in his 50s, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that had seen too many sunsets in places the map didn't name. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't have to. The threat was in his presence, in the way he occupied the space. "Specialist Vance," he said. His voice was a quiet rasp like sandpaper on wood. "You're a long way from the desert." "I like the rain," Elena said, not looking up from the paper. "It makes it harder to see the leaks." The man sat down in the chair Sarah had just vacated. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He wasn't wearing a wedding ring. His fingernails were clipped short, professional. "My name is Miller, no relation to your friend from Georgia. I'm here on behalf of people who are very concerned about your welfare." "Is that what they are calling it now?" Elena asked. "I thought I was a medical discharge. Why would anyone be concerned about a retired mechanic?" "Because you have something that doesn't belong to you," Miller said. He didn't raise his voice, but the air around the table seemed to grow colder. "The data you took from Building 104 is classified under the National Security Act. Possession of it is a felony. Distribution of it is treason. We can make this very simple, Elena. You give us the drive, you get back in the car with Staff Sergeant Davis, and we drive you to a facility where you can get the help you clearly need." "The help," Elena repeated, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. "Is that what you call a windowless room in Virginia?" "It's better than the alternative," Miller said. He glanced toward the stairs where his partner was still standing watch. "The boat docks in 10 minutes. My team is waiting at the terminal. There is no version of this night where you walk off this ferry with that data." Elena looked at him then, her eyes hard and unblinking. She saw the man for what he was, a fixer, a person who spent his life smoothing over the jagged edges of institutional failure. He thought he was the hunter. He thought he was in control of the variables. "You're right," Elena said. "I'm not walking off this boat with the data." Miller's expression relaxed just a fraction, a predatory satisfaction flickering in his eyes. "I'm glad you're being reasonable." "I'm not being reasonable," Elena said. "I'm being efficient. The data isn't here, it's already gone." Miller's face went still. The granite hardened. "Where is it?" "It's with a woman who knows exactly how to make a $4 billion mistake the lead story on the morning news," Elena said. She leaned forward, her voice a low, lethal whisper. "By the time we dock, the encryption will be cracked. By the time you find her, the story will be on the wire. You can kill me, Miller. You can kill Davis. But you can't kill the math. The gaskets failed. Sterling signed off on it. And now the whole world is going to know that you were willing to poison 100,000 people to save a budget cycle." Miller didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stared at her, and for a fleeting second, Elena saw the flicker of something she hadn't expected. It wasn't fear. It was respect. The dark, twisted respect of one professional recognizing another. "You're a good soldier, Vance," Miller said. "Loyal, capable. It's a shame you chose the wrong mission." "The mission is the truth," Elena said. "The institution is just the packaging. You forgot the difference." The ferry's horn let out a long, mournful blast, signaling the approach to the Bainbridge terminal. The vibration through the floor increased as the engines reversed, the massive boat slowing its momentum against the dark water. "Get up," Miller said, standing. "We're going down to the vehicle deck." Elena stood. Her shoulder throbbed, a rhythmic pulse of pain that synchronized with the beating of her heart. She walked toward the stairs, Miller a half-step behind her, his partner closing the distance from the door. She felt the narrowness of her world, the way the options were being stripped away until only one remained. They reached the vehicle deck just as the ferry bumped against the pilings of the terminal. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that rattled the cars in their lanes. Davis was standing by the sedan, his hands visible, his face a mask of disciplined neutrality. Two more men in dark jackets were standing near him, their posture aggressive. "Where is the woman?" Miller asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know who you're talking about," Davis said, his voice steady. Miller turned to Elena, his eyes narrowing. "You think you've won? You think a headline changes anything? Tomorrow there will be a different headline." The day after, people will have forgotten the name Robert Sterling. But you'll still be a ghost. You'll still be looking over your shoulder every time a car slows down behind you. I've been looking over my shoulder since I was 18, Elena said. I'm used to the view. The ferry ramp lowered with a mechanical groan, the heavy steel plate hitting the concrete of the dock. The cars began to move, a slow procession of headlights and exhaust. Elena watched as a taxi near the front of the line pulled away, catching a glimpse of a beige trench coat in the back seat. Sarah was gone. The data was in the wild. Let them go, Miller said into his radio. The men near Davis stepped back. Miller looked at Elena one last time. There was no anger in his face, only a cold, professional distance. You're free to go, Vance, for now, but don't think this is over. The machine doesn't stop because a part breaks. It just works around it. He turned and walked toward a black SUV parked near the stern. His team followed him, their movements synchronized and silent. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the flow of traffic, leaving Elena and Davis standing on the damp steel deck. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that exists in the eye of a storm. Elena leaned against the car, her strength suddenly flagging. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache that reached deep into her bones. Did she get away? Davis asked, stepping closer. She got away, Elena said. What now? Elena looked out at the dark water, at the reflection of the terminal lights dancing on the waves. She thought of the 240 men on the C-130s. She thought of Miller in Georgia and the nurse in the hospital wing. She thought of the 6 years she had given to a uniform that had been stripped from her in a windowless room. Now we wait, Elena said. They drove off the ferry and found a small park overlooking the sound. They sat in the car, the engine off, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon. It wasn't the dusty rose of the Utah desert. It was a cold, pale gray that turned the water into a sheet of hammered silver. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and opened a news app. She refreshed the feed. Nothing. She refreshed it again. 10 minutes passed. 20. Then it happened. Asterisk whistleblower exposes defense cover-up in Utah test site. Asterisk the headline was stark, black text on a white background. Beneath it was a photo of Building 104, a grainy satellite image that looked like a scar on the desert floor. The article was long, detailed, and devastating. It named Sterling. It named the subcontractor. It detailed the failure of the Viking gaskets and the internal memo that had authorized the bypass. But it didn't name Elena Vance. Sarah had kept her word. The story was about the failure, not the mechanic. Elena was mentioned only as a source within the program, a ghost in the narrative. It's out, Elena said, handing the phone to Davis. He read the article in silence, his jaw working. When he finished, he handed the phone back. They'll come for him now, Sterling, the Board of Inquiry. It won't be quiet anymore. They'll reassign him, Elena said, her voice devoid of illusion. They'll give him a desk in the basement of the Pentagon and wait for the news cycle to move on. The system doesn't punish its own, Davis. It just hides them. But the planes will be grounded, Elena said. The gaskets will be replaced. The test won't happen. That's enough. Davis looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Is it enough for you? Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. The cost was too high to be measured in a headline. She had lost everything she had worked for, every rank she had earned, every bit of the identity she had built since she was a girl in Montana who just wanted to know how things worked. She was 26 years old, and she was a woman without a country, without a name, and without a future. I need to go home, she said. Where is home, Vance? Montana, she said. The mountains. Somewhere the air doesn't smell like jet fuel. Davis nodded. He started the engine. I'll drive you to the state line. The trip across the Cascades was a blur of pine trees and mountain passes. Elena slept fitfully, her dreams filled with the sound of the number 3 engine failing, the rhythmic click of a plastic chair leg, and the smell of ozone. Every time she woke, she checked the news. The story was growing. Other outlets were picking it up. There were statements from the Pentagon, denials at first, then commitments to a full internal review. The machine was doing what it always did, adjusting, absorbing the blow, and preparing to continue. But the test was canceled. The 240 men were safe. That was the one truth that couldn't be erased. They reached the Montana border at dusk on the second day. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, the mountains rising up like the teeth of a saw. Davis pulled over at a small rest stop overlooking a valley that stretched out forever, a sea of golden grass swaying in the wind. This is as far as I can go, Davis said. He looked at the dashboard. I have to head back. Turn myself in. If I stay away too long, they'll call it desertion. Elena looked at him. He was a good man, a man who had done the right thing and was about to be punished for it. What will happen to you? Article 15, probably, Davis said, a small, tired smile on his face. Maybe a reduction in rank. They need MPs, Vance, especially ones who know how to keep their mouths shut. I'll be fine. Thank you, Davis, Elena said. Don't thank me. I just followed the only order that made sense. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, thick envelope. He handed it to her. Miller gave me this, too, before he left. He said it was your share of the severance package. He knew you wouldn't take it from them, so he took it for you. Elena opened the envelope. It was filled with cash, thousands of dollars, crisp and clean. I can't take this, she said. Take it, Davis said. It's not their money anymore. It's Miller's, and he wants you to have a life, buy a shop, fix some tractors, do something that matters. Elena looked at the money, then at the man who had risked everything to get her here. She realized then that the loyalty she had felt for the army hadn't been for the institution. It had been for people like Davis. People who understood that the mission wasn't about the flag or the budget. It was about the person standing next to you in the dark. Good luck, Staff Sergeant, she said. You too, Specialist, he said, his voice thick with a respect that no medal could ever convey. She stepped out of the car and watched him pull away, his taillights disappearing into the gathering shadows of the pass. She was alone now, truly alone. She stood on the edge of the asphalt, the wind whipping her hair across her face, the silence of the mountains a heavy, physical presence. She walked toward a small diner at the edge of the rest stop. It was a weather-beaten building with a neon sign that flickered with a rhythmic hum. Inside, the air smelled of fried onions and coffee. A few truckers sat at the counter, their faces etched with the weariness of the road. Elena sat in a booth in the corner, her back to the wall. She ordered a cup of black coffee and sat with her hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. She looked out the window at the valley. She felt the weight of the last 6 years sliding off her shoulders, replaced by a strange, terrifying lightness. She was no longer a soldier. She was no longer a mechanic for the state. She was just Elena Vance, a woman with a scar on her shoulder and a pocket full of cash. She thought of the machine. It was still out there, grinding away, making its calculations, protecting its failures. It would find someone to replace her. It would find a different way to test its agents. It would continue to be what it had always been, a monster of its own making. But she wasn't a part of it anymore. She had been removed, discarded, erased. And in that erasure, she had found her freedom. She pulled the silver Zippo from her pocket and set it on the table. She flicked the lid open, the metallic asterisk clack asterisk sharp in the quiet diner. She watched the small orange flame dance for a moment, then she blew it out. The smell of the wick lingered, a sharp, familiar scent that grounded her in the present. She wasn't a hero. She hadn't changed the world. She had just fixed one broken thing. But as she sat in the quiet diner, watching the moon rise over the Montana mountains, she knew it was enough. She took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, hot, and real. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She opened it to a blank page and picked up a pen. She didn't write about the desert. She didn't write about the gaskets or the planes or the man in the suit. She wrote down the name of a town 300 miles to the north. A town where they needed a mechanic who knew how to listen to the math. A town where a woman could disappear into the mountains and build something that was meant to last. She stayed in the diner for a long time, watching the world go by. She saw a young woman walk in with a dog, a golden retriever that wagged its tail at everyone it passed. She saw an old couple holding hands across a booth. She saw the mundane, beautiful reality of a world that didn't know how close it had come to breaking. She felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't joy. It was peace. The peace of a person who has done their duty and has nothing left to prove to anyone. She paid for her coffee and walked out into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant, a million tiny points of light scattered across the black velvet of the sky. She breathed in deep, the air crisp and clean, tasting of pine and snow. She walked toward the highway, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't have a car, but she had a direction. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. As she reached the edge of the road, she heard the distant, low thrum of a plane high above. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up to check the vibration or calculate the altitude. She just kept walking. The road ahead was dark, stretching out into the heart of the mountains. It was a long way to the north, a long way to the life she wanted to build. But Elena Vance knew how to travel a long way on a little bit of fuel. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped out into the night, her silhouette small against the vastness of the Montana landscape. She was a ghost, a memory, a footnote in a classified file, but she was alive. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the mountains, turning the snow a pale, brilliant white, she knew that the truth had been worth the cost. The world would move on, the headlines would fade, the machine would keep turning. But the mechanic was finally going home. She walked until the sun was high in the sky, her shadow lengthening before her on the asphalt. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in the desert but dust and lies. Ahead of her, the mountains rose up to meet the sky, a fortress of rock and ice that promised nothing but the truth. She reached a small trailhead and stopped, looking out over a pristine alpine lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains like a mirror. She sat on a rock and pulled off her boots, feeling the cold mountain air on her tired feet. She looked at her hands. They were stained with grease and grit, the marks of a lifetime of fixing things that other people had broken. She dipped them into the water, watching the dirt swirl away into the depths. She was clean. She leaned back against the rock and closed her eyes, the warmth of the sun on her face. She felt the rhythmic pulse of her own heart, the steady, reliable engine of her own life. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a specialist. She was just Elena, and that was more than enough. The silence of the mountains was absolute, a profound, healing quiet that filled the empty spaces in her soul. She stayed there for a long time, letting the world fade away until there was nothing left but the wind and the water. She had lost her place in the machine, but she had found her place in the world. She stood up and put her boots back on, her movements slow and deliberate. She felt the strength in her legs, the steady, unwavering competence of a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of. She walked back to the road and held out her hand. A few minutes later, a dusty pickup truck pulled over. The driver was an old man with a kind face and a dog in the passenger seat. "Need a lift?" he asked. "Heading north," Elena said. "Get in," the man said, shifting the dog to the floor. "I'm going as far as Missoula." Elena climbed into the cab, the smell of old tobacco and dog hair a strange comfort. The man put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. "You from around here?" he asked. "Used to be," Elena said, looking out the window at the passing trees. "I'm just getting back." "Well, welcome home," the man said. Elena watched the mountains go by, the peaks rising up like guardians of the land. She felt a quiet, steady hope blooming in her chest, a small flame that she knew would never go out. She had paid the cost. She had told the truth, and now she was free to build something that wouldn't break. The truck rumbled on, the sound of the tires a rhythmic pulse on the road. Elena leaned her head against the window and watched the world go by. She was a ghost in the system, a woman without a name, but she was the one who had saved the day. And as the sun began to set over the western horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Elena Vance finally closed her eyes and let the world go. She was home. The diner sat at the edge of the world, a small island of light in the vast, dark sea of the Montana night. Inside, a woman sat at the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked like anyone else, a traveler, a local, a ghost. But she knew the truth, and that was the only thing that mattered. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at her reflection in the window. She saw a woman who had been through the fire and come out the other side. She saw a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark. She saw herself. She smiled, a small private smile that was for her and her alone. Then she stood up, left a $5 bill on the counter, and walked out into the night. The road was waiting, and so was the rest of her life. She walked until the stars were the only light left in the world. She walked until her legs ached and her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She walked until she reached a small, quiet town tucked into the folds of the mountains. She found a room in a small boarding house, a clean, simple space with a bed and a window that looked out over the valley. She lay down on the bed and closed her eyes. She didn't dream of the desert. She didn't dream of the plains. She dreamt of the mountains. And when she woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and the world was new. She walked down to the local garage, a small, cluttered shop with the smell of oil and old metal. She talked to the owner, a man with grease under his fingernails and a look of quiet competence in his eyes. She told him she was a mechanic. She told him she knew how to fix things. He looked at her hands, then at her eyes. "Start on Monday," he said. Elena Vance walked out of the shop and into the bright morning sun. She felt the weight of the wrench in her hand, the familiar, comforting weight of the tools she had used all her life. She was back at work. She was fixing the world one engine at a time. And this time she was doing it on her own terms. She walked down to the river and sat on the bank, watching the water flow past. She felt the peace of the mountains, the quiet, steady strength of the land. She was home, and she was never going back. The story of the Viking gaskets and the West Desert Test Center would become a legend, a cautionary tale of institutional failure and the cost of silence. But the name Elena Vance would never be a part of it. She was the ghost who had saved the world, the mechanic who had fixed the machine by breaking it. And she was okay with that. She didn't need the medals. She didn't need the recognition. She had the truth. And that was the only thing that had ever mattered. She sat by the river until the sun went down, watching the light fade from the sky. She felt the cold mountain air on her face, the sharp, clean taste of the wind. She was alive. She was free, and she was finally, truly herself. She stood up and walked back to her room, her footsteps steady on the path. She felt the strength in her body, the quiet, unwavering power of a woman who had survived the worst the world could throw at her and come out stronger. She opened the door to her room and looked at the small, simple space. It was enough. She sat at the window and watched the stars come out, one by one. She felt the vastness of the universe, the infinite possibilities of the night. She was a part of it all, and she was ready for whatever came next. The machine was still out there, turning its gears, making its calculations. But Elena Vance was no longer a cog in its works. She was the one who had walked away. She was the one who had stayed true, and as she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, she knew that the world was a little bit safer because of what she had done. The mechanic had finished her work, and the rest was silence. She woke to the sound of a meadowlark, a clear, liquid song that cut through the morning mist. She dressed in her work clothes, tough denim and a flannel shirt, and tied her hair back with a piece of twine. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin. The scar on her shoulder was a dark, jagged line, but it didn't hurt anymore. It was just a mark, a signature. She walked to the garage, the gravel crunching under her boots. The air was cold, but the sun was already beginning to warm the back of her neck. When she arrived, the owner, a man named Silas, was already there, hunched over the open hood of an old international harvester. "Morning," he said, not looking up. "Morning," Elena replied. She picked up a wrench from the bench. It was heavy, balanced, and familiar. She stepped up to the tractor and looked at the engine. It was a simple machine built for endurance, not for speed. It was honest. She spent the day submerged in the rhythm of the work. The smell of old grease, the resistance of a rusted bolt, the satisfying click of a gear falling into place. It was a language she spoke better than any other. By noon, the harvester was humming, a steady, rhythmic pulse that echoed the beating of her own heart. Silas wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her. "You've got a gift, Vance. You don't just fix M, you listen to M. They tell you what's wrong if you know how to hear it," she said. She stayed late that evening, cleaning the shop after Silas went home. She liked the quiet of the garage at dusk, the way the light faded from the rafters and the tools cast long, silver shadows on the floor. She sat on the workbench and pulled the silver Zippo from her pocket. She didn't light it. She just felt the weight of it, the history of it. She thought of Miller. She hoped he was sitting on a porch in Savannah, watching the fireflies and breathing in the humid, sweet air of the South. She hoped he had found a way to spend that money on something that made him forget the sound of the desert. She thought of Davis. She hoped he was back in his boots, standing watch, being the kind of man the uniform was meant for. And she thought of Sterling. She didn't feel rage anymore. She just felt a profound, cold distance. He was a man who had traded his soul for a seat at a table that was already rotting. He was the one who was truly erased, even if his name was still on a door at the Pentagon. She stood up and walked to the back of the shop, where a small radio sat on a shelf. She turned it on, the static giving way to a local news broadcast. And in national news, the Department of Defense has announced the permanent cancellation of the Viking dispersal program, citing unforeseen logistical challenges and a shift in strategic priorities. Outgoing Undersecretary Robert Sterling has declined to comment on the decision. Elena turned the radio off. The shift in priorities, that was what they called it. They couldn't admit the truth, so they dressed it up in the language of the machine. But it didn't matter what they called it. The result was the same. The gaskets would never fly. The agent would stay in the dark. She walked out of the garage and locked the door. The town was quiet, the only sound the wind in the pines and the distant rush of the river. She walked toward the boarding house, her steps light. She reached the bridge over the river and stopped. She looked down at the water, churning white and cold over the rocks. She took the thumb drive from her pocket, the backup Davis had given her, the one she had kept just in case. She looked at it for a long time. It was the only thing left of the desert, the only thing left of Building 104. She let it go. She watched it fall, a tiny silver spark that disappeared into the white foam of the river. It was gone. The data, the secrets, the weight of it all, it was all washed away. She turned and continued across the bridge. She didn't look back. The next morning, she went to the local hardware store and bought a small plot of land on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just an acre of rocks and scrub brush with a view of the peaks. But it was hers. She spent her weekends building a small cabin. She did it all herself, from the foundation to the roof. She used reclaimed timber and local stone. She built it the way she fixed engines, with precision, patience, and a refusal to cut corners. It took her 6 months. By the time the first snow of the winter began to fall, she had a fire in the hearth and a roof that didn't leak. She sat by the window on a cold November evening, watching the flakes drift down from the gray sky. She had a dog now, a stray she had found near the garage, a scruffy, loyal terrier mix that she had named Gasket. He was curled up at her feet, his breathing steady and deep. She felt a sense of completion she had never known. She was no longer waiting for the next failure. She was no longer tracking the vibration. She was just home. She reached for a book on the table, but her hand stopped near a small, framed photograph. It was a picture Silas had taken of her in the garage, her face smudged with oil, a wrench in her hand, and a rare, genuine smile on her lips. She looked at the woman in the photo. She looked strong. She looked capable. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was. Elena Vance turned off the lamp and sat in the glow of the fire. The mountains were silent, a vast, white wilderness that stretched out to the edge of the world. She felt the peace of the land, the quiet strength of the winter. She was the mechanic, and the machine was finally at rest. She woke the next day to a world turned white. The snow was deep, muffling the sounds of the town and turning the cabin into a sanctuary. She spent the morning chopping wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe a familiar comfort. She felt the strength in her arms, the steady, reliable power of her own body. She was 27 years old. She had a whole life ahead of her, a life that belonged to her and no one else. She walked down to the garage, her boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. The town was beautiful in the snow, a quiet, peaceful place that felt 1,000 miles away from the desert. When she arrived, Silas was waiting for her with a thermos of hot coffee. "Got a big one today, Vance," he said, gesturing toward a massive logging truck that had been towed in overnight. "Transmission's shot. Thought you might want to take a look." Elena set her bag on the bench and rolled up her sleeves. She looked at the truck, a giant of steel and iron that had been broken by the mountains. "I'll take a look," she said. She climbed under the chassis, the cold metal biting into her skin. She reached for her wrench and began to work. She felt the familiar resistance, the hidden language of the machine. She listened to the gears, the bearings, the rhythmic pulse of the engine. She knew exactly what was wrong, and she knew exactly how to fix it. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, her movements precise and efficient. She didn't think about the Pentagon. She didn't think about the C-130s. She just thought about the truck. She thought about the man who needed it to feed his family. She thought about the work that needed to be done. By sunset, the transmission was rebuilt. The truck was humming, a powerful, steady vibration that shook the floor of the garage. Silas shook his head in amazement. "I don't know how you do it, Vance. You're like a surgeon with a torque wrench." "It's just math, Silas," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "Everything has a failure point. You just have to find it before it finds you." She walked home in the twilight, the stars beginning to peek through the clearing clouds. She felt the cold, crisp air in her lungs, the sharp, clean taste of the winter. She reached her cabin and stepped inside. The fire was still burning, a low, warm glow that welcomed her home. She sat in her chair and looked out the window at the mountains. She felt a quiet, steady peace, a peace that came from knowing she had done the right thing, a peace that came from knowing she was finally where she was meant to be. She wasn't a hero. She was a mechanic, and that was all she ever wanted to be. She picked up her notebook and opened it to a blank page. She didn't write about the past. She wrote about the future. She wrote about the garden she wanted to plant in the spring. She wrote about the shop she wanted to open. She wrote about the life she was building, one day at a time. She was Elena Vance, and she was home. The mountains stood tall and silent, a fortress of rock and ice that guarded the secrets of the land. They had seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of stars. They didn't care about the gaskets or the budget or the men in suits. They only cared about the truth. And as Elena Vance closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, she knew that she was finally a part of that truth. She was the ghost who had stayed. She was the mechanic who had fixed it all, and the world was a better place because of it. She slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind of sleep that only comes to those who have found their peace. And when she woke up, the sun was shining on the snow and the world was waiting. She walked to the window and looked out at the valley. She saw the smoke rising from the chimneys of the town. She saw the tracks of the deer in the snow. She saw the beauty and the mystery of the life she had chosen. She smiled. It was a good day to be a mechanic. She picked up her bag and headed out the door, her footsteps steady on the path. She had work to do. She had a life to live, and she was ready for all of it. The machine was gone. The desert was a memory. The mountains were home, and Elena Vance was free. She walked down to the garage, the sun bright on her face. She felt the strength in her heart, the steady, unwavering power of a woman who had found her way back to the truth. She was the one who knew how it worked, and she was the one who knew how to make it last. She opened the door to the shop and stepped inside, the smell of oil and old metal a warm, familiar welcome. She picked up her wrench and began to work. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The air in the garage was cold, smelling of gear oil and wood smoke from the small stove in the corner. Elena stood over the workbench, her fingers moving with a muscle memory that didn't require her mind to participate. She was cleaning a set of fuel injectors from a neighbor's truck, the rhythmic clicking of the metal components the only sound in the quiet space. She thought about the way things fit together. How 1,000 separate parts, each with its own tolerance and its own history, could come together to create a single, powerful motion. It was a miracle of engineering, a testament to the human desire to move, to build, to overcome. But she also knew how easily it could all fall apart. A single flaw, a hidden crack, a decision made in a room far away, that was all it took to turn a miracle into a catastrophe. She hadn't just fixed engines in the desert. She had fixed a broken sense of duty. She had realized that her loyalty wasn't to the machine itself, but to the people the machine was meant to serve. She set the injector down and walked to the door. The sun was setting behind the peaks, casting a long, golden light across the snow. It was a beautiful, quiet moment, the kind of moment that reminded her why she had fought so hard to get here. She thought of the men on the C-130s. They were probably home now, too, sitting at their own tables, kissing their own wives, playing with their own children. They didn't know her name. They didn't know about the gaskets or the Zippo or the room at Fort Douglas. They just knew they were alive, and that was the only commendation she ever needed. She went back to the workbench and picked up the next injector. She didn't need the world to know what she had done. She didn't need the medals or the speeches. She had the quiet, steady knowledge of the truth. She was a mechanic in a small town in Montana. She fixed tractors and trucks and the occasional chainsaw. She lived in a cabin she had built with her own hands. She had a dog that followed her everywhere. She was exactly who she was meant to be. The mountains turned a deep, bruised purple as the light faded. The first stars began to appear, tiny sparks of light in the vast, cold darkness. Elena turned on the shop light, a single hanging bulb that cast a warm circle of light over the workbench. She went back to work. There were engines to fix. There was a life to live, and there was a peace that passeth all understanding. She worked late into the night, the steady rhythm of the tools a comfort in the silence. When she finally finished, she cleaned her tools and put them away, each one in its proper place. She wiped down the bench and turned off the light. She walked home under the stars, the snow crunching under her boots. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it. She felt the warmth of the cabin waiting for her. She felt the strength of the mountains surrounding her. She was home, and the truth was finally, quietly enough. She sat on her porch for a moment before going inside, watching the moon rise over the valley. The world was a big place, full of broken things and people who didn't know how to fix them. But in this one small corner of the world, things were right. She stood up and walked inside, closing the door against the cold. She stirred the fire and sat in her chair, the dog resting his head on her knee. She was Elena Vance, and she was exactly where she belonged. The mission was over. The silence was complete, and the mechanic was at peace. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire wash over her. She felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of her own life, a machine that was finally, perfectly in tune. She slept until the sun came up, a deep, restorative sleep that left her feeling strong and ready for the day. She walked down to the garage, the sun bright on the snow. She felt the strength in her heart, the steady, unwavering power of a woman who had found her way back to the truth. She opened the door to the shop and stepped inside, the smell of oil and old metal a warm, familiar welcome. She picked up her wrench and began to work. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The wrench felt solid in her hand, the weight of it a grounding force as she leaned into the stubborn bolt of a tractor's manifold. She didn't mind the resistance. She knew how to apply the right amount of pressure, how to coax the metal into doing what it was designed to do. In the quiet of the morning, with the sun slanting through the high windows of the shop, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The world outside might be complicated and full of compromise, but here, in the presence of steel and math, there was only the truth of the machine. She thought of the man she had been in the desert, the woman who had stood on the tarmac and refused to blink. That version of herself wasn't gone. She was just integrated now, a part of the woman who could fix a transmission or build a cabin or walk through a winter forest without fear. She had learned that the most extraordinary hidden capability wasn't the ability to spot a failing gasket. It was the ability to stand in the truth when the whole world was trying to lie to you. She finished the manifold and stood up, stretching her back. Silas came in a few minutes later, carrying a box of parts and a look of quiet admiration. "You're something else, Vance," he said, nodding toward the tractor. "Most people would have given up on that old girl years ago." "She's got a lot of life left in her," Elena said, wiping her hands on a rag. "She just needed someone to listen." She walked to the door and looked out at the mountains. The snow was beginning to melt, the first hints of spring appearing in the greening of the valley floor. It was a time of renewal, of things coming back to life. She felt a surge of hope, a small, steady flame that she knew would never go out. She had been erased, but she had rewritten herself. She had been silenced, but she had found a way to be heard. She was a ghost, perhaps, but she was a ghost with a life, a ghost with a home, a ghost who knew how to fix anything that was broken. She went back to her bench and picked up a small, silver object. It was the Zippo Miller had given her. She ran her thumb over the smooth metal, feeling the history of it. She didn't need it to light a fire anymore. She had her own fire now. She placed the lighter in a small wooden box on the shelf, a place for things that were no longer needed but would never be forgotten. She closed the lid and went back to work. The mountains stood watch, silent and eternal. The river flowed on, carrying the secrets of the past into the heart of the world. And in a small garage in Montana, a woman with a scar on her shoulder and a pocket full of tools sat at a workbench and listened to the math. She was Elena Vance, and she was finally, truly free. The final sentence of the entire story would not be a summary or an explanation. It would simply be true. She reached for the next engine, her hands steady, her mind clear, her heart at rest. The day went on, the sun moving slowly across the sky, the shadows lengthening in the valley. Elena worked with a focused intensity, a dark competence that needed no audience. She was the mechanic and the world was her machine. She was right where she was supposed to be. The sun touched the horizon, turning the peaks of the mountains into a wall of fire. Elena stood at the door of the garage, the cool evening air on her face. She felt the strength of the land, the quiet, steady power of the truth. She was home and she was never going back. She closed the shop door and locked it, the metallic click of final, satisfying sound in the quiet evening. She walked toward her cabin, her boots light on the path. She reached her porch and sat in the chair, watching the stars come out. She felt the peace of the night, the infinite beauty of the world. She was Elena Vance, and she was whole. The fire in the hearth was a low, warm glow, casting long shadows across the room. Elena sat with the dog at her feet, a book in her lap, and the silence of the mountains surrounding her. She felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of her own life, a machine that was finally, perfectly in tune. She closed her eyes and let the world go. She was home. The mountains turned a deep, bruised purple as the light faded. The first stars began to appear, tiny sparks of light in the vast, cold darkness. Elena turned on the shop light, a single hanging bulb that cast a warm circle of light over the workbench. She went back to work. There were engines to fix. There was a life to live, and there was a peace that passeth all understanding. She worked late into the night, the steady rhythm of the tools a comfort in the silence. When she finally finished, she cleaned her tools and put them away, each one in its proper place. She wiped down the bench and turned off the light. She walked home under the stars, the snow crunching under her boots. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it. She felt the warmth of the cabin waiting for her. She felt the strength of the mountains surrounding her. She was home, and the truth was finally, quietly enough. She sat on her porch for a moment before going inside, watching the moon rise over the valley. The world was a big place, full of broken things and people who didn't know how to fix them. But in this one small corner of the world, things were right. She stood up and walked inside, closing the door against the cold. She stirred the fire and sat in her chair, the dog resting his head on her knee. She was Elena Vance, and she was exactly where she belonged. The mission was over. The silence was complete, and the mechanic was at peace. She sat in the darkness of her cabin, the only light the dying embers of the fire. She felt the weight of her life, not as a burden, but as a foundation. She was a woman who had seen the worst of the system and chosen to be the best of herself. She had survived the desert, the eraser, and the silence, and she had come out on the other side with her soul intact. She looked at her hands in the dim light. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who worked for a living, who solved problems with steel and sweat. They were the most honest things she owned. She wasn't waiting for a medal. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She was just waiting for Monday morning when there would be a broken tractor in the yard and a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. She leaned her head back and let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 6 years was gone. The countdown in her head had finally reached 0, and the world hadn't ended. It had just begun. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind in the pines. It was a lonely sound, but it wasn't a sad one. It was the sound of the world being exactly what it was without any lies to cover it up. She was Elena Vance, and she was the only one who needed to know what that meant. She stood up, walked to the window, and watched the moonlight wash over the valley. The snow was blue in the light, the trees casting long, black shadows that reached toward the river. It was a world that didn't owe her anything, and a world she didn't owe anything to in return. She was free. She turned away from the window and went to bed, the quiet of the mountains settling over her like a heavy blanket. She slept without dreaming, a deep, perfect rest that lasted until the sun touched the peaks. She woke up, put on her boots, and walked out into the cold, bright morning to start the fire. She didn't look at the sky to see if there were planes. She just looked at the wood in her hands and knew that it would burn.